There's no opening title card here. What you get instead is breath itself. Breath moving across the surface of water. Breath stirring through dust particles. Breath traveling through the corridors of time. What we call the Old Testament is actually a library, a living collection of different voices speaking across centuries. These voices are fierce and fragile at once, poetic yet filled with rage, containing both lore and legend, both lament and deep longing. We're talking about 1,000 years' worth of memories from the desert, carefully stitched together by scribes who had no idea they were creating something permanent. And this is where our journey together starts. Before we dive in, please make sure you hit that like button and click subscribe. Doing so helps other curious minds discover this content. Also, drop a comment letting us know your location and what time of day you're tuning in. Now, without any more delay, let's get into it, shall we? The text speaks in multiple languages, yet underneath it all hums a single frequency. It's the collision between the divine and the human, rarely polite, frequently violent, perpetually mysterious. This is not a gentle book. Safety isn't part of its promise, yet it remains profoundly human at its core. In Hebrew, it's known as Tanakh, which is actually an acronym representing its three main divisions: Torah, meaning law; Nevi Ayam, meaning prophets; Ketuvim, meaning writings. Christians took this collection, rearranged its order, and labeled it the Old Testament, as though marking it as something that came before. But for millions of people today, it still exists in present tense. It never ceased being. It never stopped speaking. This wasn't composed in one session or by a single author. The stories contained within were born around campfires, inside royal courts, on dusty scrolls handed down through generations. Many of the earliest narratives were kept alive orally, committed to memory, chanted aloud, repeated until they settled deep like sand, settling into the soul. Some verses predate the very concept of alphabet. Some ideas within these pages fundamentally reshaped humanity's understanding of time itself. The Old Testament doesn't emerge from the peaceful sanctuary of a philosopher's study. Instead, it comes from the crossroads where ancient empires intersected. Egypt, lying to the south, Babylon positioned to the east, with Hittites, Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks all rising and collapsing around a narrow strip of land roughly the size of New Jersey. The world that gave birth to the Old Testament had already aged considerably before these texts began. Civilizations had already risen, developed writing systems, and fallen into ruin. Ziggurats towered above the Euphrates River. Pyramids cast their shadows across the Nile. Trade routes hummed with the exchange of copper, incense, and gossip between peoples. Religion saturated everything, and deities existed everywhere. Sun deities, river deities, goddesses of fertility, storm gods riding chariots made of lightning. Into this polytheistic symphony emerged something strange and new, a whisper, a declaration from the wilderness, one God, invisible without a given name, a God who didn't inhabit temples or statues, but existed in covenant. Relationship, not ritual, became the foundation. This wasn't evolution. This was revolution. Initially, this God appeared to wanderers, to shepherds and exiles, to men commanding no armies and women bearing no children. The narrative begins with a single family, but like a seed planted in soil, it unfolds slowly, branching outward into a nation, fragmenting into kingdoms, shattering into exile, flowering into poetry, hardening into law. The earliest sections, the Torah, the 5 books attributed to Moses, form the backbone. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Together, these books present the origin story not merely of a people, but of reality itself. Earth, sky, stars, and ethics all emerge here, a divine drama with cosmic implications and intimate particulars. Following these come the historical books: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. They read like a national journal. Victories achieved, promises shattered, kings ascending and descending like waves on a turbulent sea. The prophets interrupt the rhythm entirely. They don't narrate stories. Instead, they cry out, they rage, they weep, they warn, they plead. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, plus the 12 so-called minor prophets who were anything but minor in the intensity of their fury. Their visions arrive in riddles and thunder. They speak of justice as though it were fire, and hope as though it were rain falling on desert ground. The writings are something altogether different. Ecclesiastes, that ancient philosopher dressed in black, declaring everything meaningless, yet still grasping at the beauty found in the present moment. Job, engaged in argument with God while sitting on an ash heap. Psalms, serving as the hymnal of the human heart. Proverbs, offering street-smart wisdom for everyday living. Song of Songs, a love poem so sensual that some rabbis blush at its inclusion. Taken together, they don't represent one voice but rather a chorus, not a formula but a fracture, a tapestry torn apart and rewoven repeatedly. They contradict one another, mirror one another, respond to one another. In one verse, God appears transcendent and unreachable, speaking from flame. In another passage, he walks through a garden at evening time, asking questions like any father would. In one psalm, he shelters those with broken hearts. In another, he conceals his face. In one moment, he floods an entire world. In another, he kneels beside a barren woman and makes her a promise about a son. The God portrayed in the Old Testament is anything but abstract. He's personal, intimate, sometimes terrifying, sometimes tender, always present or maddeningly absent. For the people who carried these stories, Israel, the Old Testament wasn't mythology, it was memory itself. Memory written in blood, bread, and song. Memory of deliverance from Egyptian bondage, of commandments carved into stone tablets, of exile beside Babylon's rivers, of return and the reconstruction of ruins. These memories shaped identity. They defined who they were, and equally important, who they were not. You were once strangers in a strange land, the text keeps repeating. Therefore, love the stranger. History and ethics became intertwined. Myth and mandate became inseparable. It's tempting to approach the Old Testament as a collection of moral fables. It's not that. The heroes display deep flaws. Abraham lies to save himself. Jacob cheats his own brother. Moses rash in anger. David lusts and schemes with deadly consequences. Solomon constructs a temple for God, then builds shrines for idols. But this, too, reveals the text's brilliance. It doesn't sanitize its subjects. It exposes them fully. Because the true subject isn't the perfection of people, but rather the persistence of God's presence. Generation after generation, the same cycle repeats itself. Calling, covenant, rebellion, judgment, forgiveness, renewal, again and again, forming a spiral rather than a straight line. Even the formation of these texts involved tension and debate. Some books gained acceptance early, others sparked debate for centuries. Scrolls were discovered, edited, restored. The canon wasn't delivered from heaven fully formed. It was curated, cared for, copied by hand in candle-lit corners of history. By the time the Second Temple stood in Jerusalem, most of the Hebrew Bible had reached completion, yet it remained open to interpretation and vibrantly alive. By that era, Greek philosophical ideas were circulating through the region. Soon, Rome would march across the land like an iron giant. The old prophets had fallen silent, but their words continued echoing. And even in silence, the Old Testament kept speaking. It shaped liturgy, law, philosophy, politics. It became the script for revolutions and reformations. For centuries, it was copied, studied, whispered, chanted in caves, synagogues, churches, and underground catacombs. To this very day, its fingerprints appear everywhere. In art, in literature, in courtroom oaths and protest chants. Its language shaped kings and prophets, prisoners and pilgrims. This is not an easy book to read. It's not meant to be easy. But it is a book that understands your condition. It knows about longing and loss. It knows exile intimately. It knows beauty and betrayal, silence, and the unbearable weight of waiting. The Old Testament begins with breath. It concludes with a pause, not a final conclusion, but rather a holding of breath, a stillness that precedes a storm. And so we begin. In the beginning, there exists no sound, no light, no shape, only the void stretching endlessly and the breath waiting to move across it. Then a word arrives. Let there be light, and there is light. The opening sentence of Genesis initiates not merely a story, but an entire cosmos, one born from voice rather than violence, order rather than chaos. The Hebrew word employed here is bara, meaning to create, but it carries more weight than simple making. It speaks of forming with intention, of shaping reality through speech alone. Genesis chapter 1 unfolds like poetry across 6 days, each containing rhythm, repetition, rising motion. Day 1 brings light. Day and night separate like fruit being split open. Day 2 divides the waters above from the waters below, creating a dome called the sky. Day 3 causes dry land to appear, then vegetation sprouts without seed or gardener tending it. Day 4 sets lights in the heavens, sun, moon, stars placed there to mark time's passage. Day 5 fills seas with fish and skies with birds. Day 6 brings land animals roaming freely. And finally, humanity gets shaped in the image of God, not formed from chaos, but from speech, from a mind that perceives order and pronounces it good. And God saw that it was good. This phrase appears 7 times. The 7th day brings a pause, a sacred rest. No creation occurs, only completion. Genesis chapter 1 isn't merely about how the world began. It's about why it began. It speaks of a cosmos crafted with care, shaped by wisdom, anchored by rhythm and purpose. It declares that the world is no accident. It's intentional. It's good. But Genesis chapter 2 tells a different beginning. This time there's no great expanse, no voice speaking from the heights, only a mist rising from the ground. Earth, dust, clay shaped by hands rather than words, a garden rather than a globe. God forms a human from dust and breathes into its nostrils. Life stirs, not just existence, but a living soul. In Hebrew, the human is called Adam. Not yet a proper name, just a being fashioned from Adamah, the ground. The human gets placed in a garden called Eden, a place of delight rather than wilderness. Trees grow there, including 2 that hold secrets about life and knowledge. But the human is alone. So from its side, another gets formed. Not from dust, but from within, bone of bone, flesh of flesh, not a helper as servant, but as mirror. The 2 stand naked, unashamed. Genesis chapter 2 is quieter, more intimate. No grand declarations, no cosmic architecture. Just soil, breath, trees, and companionship. 2 beginnings presented side by side, one cosmic, one personal. One begins with light, the other with soil. One speaks of humanity as image-bearers of God. The other shows humans walking with God in a garden. Both stories stand together, placed not to contradict, but to complete each other. These texts were written in a world already shaped by other creation myths, powerful ones from Babylon, Akkad, and Sumer. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the world begins through violence. The gods wage war against each other. Marduk slays the dragon Tiamat and splits her body apart to form the heavens and earth. In the Akkadian Atrahasis, humans are fashioned from clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god, created to serve as workers so the gods can rest. In Egypt, the god Atum brings creation from the waters of chaos by naming things into being, a theme shared with Genesis, yet the tone differs significantly. The ancient world understood creation through blood, battle, and divine conflict. But Genesis says, no, not like that. The world, it declares, was made in peace, made with speech, made with rest. This was a radical idea, that creation was good, that humanity carried divine image, that the earth was not a battleground but a temple. It's no accident that Genesis chapter 1 is structured like the building of a temple. 6 stages of order, followed by a final day of rest. The 7th day, holy, set apart. Just as ancient temples were completed and then filled with divine presence, so this world concludes with rest. Not idleness, but completion. Even the rhythm of the days, evening and morning, forms a liturgy. Time itself becomes sacred. The Hebrew imagination doesn't separate the sacred from the everyday. The ground is holy, time is holy, breath is holy. To work reflects the Creator. To rest honors the pattern. And in this world, humans are not divine. But neither are they merely dirt. They are both, formed from dust, yet filled with breath, earthbound and image-bearing. To be human in this story means walking a strange tension, mortal yet meaningful, small yet chosen. And yet all is not secure. Genesis chapter 2 ends not with triumph, but with a warning. One tree must remain untouched, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not about information, but moral autonomy. To eat means deciding for oneself what is right and wrong. To reject the voice of the Creator. The stage is set for a fall, but for now, the garden remains whole. And so 2 stories sit at the opening of the Old Testament. One tells of a cosmos ordered by voice and rhythm. The other speaks of a garden filled with breath, beauty, and the first boundaries. They are neither science nor fantasy. They are the deep poetry of origins, memory shaped by meaning. They don't ask you to measure the age of stars. They ask, who made this world? Why are we here? What does it mean to be human? And what happens when we walk away? These questions will echo through the rest of the Old Testament, through every exile, every law, every prophet's cry. The foundation has been laid, a cosmos from chaos, a human from dust, a garden with gates, a choice yet to be made. Next comes the exile, but before that arrives the whisper of temptation. The garden is a place of simplicity. Trees grow without labor required. Animals walk alongside you peacefully. Rivers divide the land into 4 branches. Gold lies in the soil. No one experiences death. You are naked and feel no shame. Into this stillness you are placed. Dust, breath, movement. You are not born. You are formed. Your shape is intentional. You are a vessel fashioned from the earth, and into you flows divine breath. The first command isn't to worship, not to sacrifice, not to build monuments. The first command is to tend and to keep, stewardship, responsibility. But one tree is forbidden. The fruit itself isn't cursed, but the boundary is clear and firm. You may eat from every tree, but not that one. To cross that line means death will enter. This is not a threat, it's a truth. Death will enter the story if you eat, and yet the tree remains within reach. This is freedom, the possibility of choice. Without it, there's no meaning to obedience. Then you are no longer alone. Bone from bone, flesh from flesh, a partner, not a servant, not a replica, not a subordinate, a counterpart, a mirror in human form. Together you walk the garden paths. Together you receive dominion. Together you're told to multiply and fill the earth. Naked, unashamed, whole. And then the voice comes. It's not a roar or a trumpet blast. It's a whisper, a question. Did God really say? The serpent doesn't instruct directly. He suggests. He reframes the boundary as deprivation. He paints obedience as blindness. God knows that if you eat, your eyes will be opened. The fruit looks good. The tree seems wise. The desire awakens. She takes it. She eats. She gives to him. He eats. There is no resistance, no protest. The silence of the man is deafening. and their eyes are opened. But what do they see? Not divine heights, not secret wisdom. They see themselves, naked, exposed, ashamed. They sew fig leaves together. They cover what once needed no covering. They hide. Then comes the sound no one has heard before, the footsteps of God in the garden. It is evening. The wind is soft. The voice calls out, "Where are you?" Not because he doesn't know, but because the question must be asked. Because they must answer, "I was afraid." The first confession is not pride, it is fear. Not guilt initially, fear. Fear enters the human soul not as punishment, but as a consequence of knowledge. Their awareness has changed. So has their intimacy. God asks, "Who told you that you were naked?" A simple question, but the answer contains layers. It wasn't the serpent, it was the act, it was the rupture. Then the blame begins. "The woman you gave me, the serpent deceived me." No one says, "I did it." The curses follow. Not random punishments, but consequences that mirror the act. The ground, once generous, will resist your efforts. The woman, once the source of life, will labor in pain. The man, once at peace with the soil, will fight it to survive. The serpent, once a whisperer, will crawl. And then they are clothed, not with fig leaves but with garments of skin. An animal has died, blood has been shed, covering now requires sacrifice, shame now requires death. Then they are sent away. This is exile, not annihilation, not vengeance, but distance. The garden gets guarded. The tree of life is now protected by flame and sword. Immortality mixed with rebellion is dangerous. Outside the garden, life begins anew. They build a home, they bear children. The firstborn becomes a farmer, the second becomes a shepherd. One offers grain, the other offers flesh. One is accepted, the other is not. Jealousy ignites. Cain kills Abel. The blood cries from the ground. God asks again, "Where is your brother?" Another silence, another lie. "Am I my brother's keeper?" And again, exile. Cain wanders. A mark protects him, but he cannot return. He builds cities. Civilization begins with murder. Generations pass, the lineages grow. Some walk with God, most walk away. The world fills with violence. The hearts of men bend toward evil. Regret enters the divine heart. Not weakness, not error, grief. So comes the flood. One man finds favor, Noah. He builds an ark, he gathers the animals, the rains come, the waters rise. 40 days, 40 nights, all is lost. But then the waters recede. A dove returns with an olive branch. Dry land appears. A rainbow marks the sky. A covenant is made. But humanity repeats itself. Noah's sons multiply. Their children spread across the land. They build a tower, not for shelter, not for worship, but for glory. Let us make a name for ourselves. Babel rises, a ziggurat reaching toward the heavens. God sees, not the tower itself, but the intention behind it. Unity without humility becomes danger. Language shatters, confusion spreads. The people scatter. Another exile. Over and over, the pattern repeats. Intimacy, rebellion, distance. But each exile is also a doorway. Each fall becomes a setting for something greater. Eden is not erased. It becomes a memory, a symbol, a promise. This is not just a story of failure. This is the story of human nature. We desire knowledge. We seek control. We redefine freedom as independence. But each grasp removes us further from the center. We hide. We cover ourselves. We blame others. But the voice still calls out, "Where are you?" In every age, this question echoes. It is the question of conscience, of identity, of relationship. God is not absent. He walks even in exile. He speaks even to wanderers. He marks even murderers. He remembers. The story of Eden is the story of us, not a tale of ancient trees, but of daily choices. Every act of disobedience carries exile within it, but every exile carries the hint of return. A sword guards the garden, but the tree of life still waits. From Cain's shadow to Babel's sky, the garden was closed. Adam and Eve stood at the edge of the world they had known, cast into dust and distance. Behind them, paradise sealed like a wound. Before them, the slow grind of history unfolding. They had sons, Cain and Abel. One worked the ground, the other tended flocks. The firstborn tilled a cursed earth, the second wandered with sheep. When the time came for offerings, each brought their share. Abel's gift, fat portions from his flock, was received with favor. Cain's grains from his soil-worn harvest met with silence. No thunder from heaven, no booming rejection, just divine absence, the kind that festers. Cain burned with resentment, not at God but at his brother. The younger had outshone the elder. The divine had chosen sides. In a field beneath the open sky, the older spilled the blood of the younger. It was the first killing between humans, not for survival, not for justice, but for favor. God found Cain, of course. Where is your brother? I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The silence that followed stretched from that moment until now, a question not answered but inherited, still asked in boardrooms, war rooms, bedrooms. Cain was not executed. He was marked, not as a curse but as a warning. A wanderer now, banished from his land, yet protected from death. Even wrath had its limits. He fled east of Eden, built a city in exile, named it after his son. Civilization began not with the innocent, but with the condemned. From Cain's line came tools, music, metallurgy, city walls, bronze blades, the lyre and the pipe. Culture didn't descend from purity. It came from bloodlines stained with fratricide and invention. Time passed, generations multiplied, and the world turned dark. The sons of men grew many, and among them strange unions took place. The sons of God, whoever they were, took the daughters of men. Giants were born, heroes of old, shadows of myth, but the core was rotting. The text says simply, every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. A line so blunt, it reads like a verdict. So the Creator grieved, not raged, not thundered, grieved, and in grief came decision. The world once called good would be undone. A man was chosen, Noah, blameless in his generation, not perfect, just alone in his integrity. He was told to build an ark, not a boat, not a ship, a box, sealed and measured, a floating coffin for the old world, a cradle for the new. Animals were gathered, pairs and sevens, clean and unclean. The details vary, but the point is clear. Preservation through judgment. Rain came, 40 days, 40 nights, the decreation of Genesis. The fountains of the deep opened, the skies collapsed, chaos returned. The ark floated above a world that had drowned. The silence after the storm stretched long, mountains submerged, trees erased, cities swept clean. And then the rain stopped. Waters receded. The ark came to rest on Ararat, though no one is quite sure where that is. A raven flew, circling endlessly, then a dove, returning with a branch. Signs of dry land, signs of beginning. Noah stepped out into a new world. The first act? A sacrifice, burnt offerings from the saved. God smelled the aroma and resolved, never again. Not because humans had changed, but because they hadn't. The inclination of the heart is evil from youth. And yet, grace. A rainbow arched across the sky, a bow laid down, a weapon unstrung. Not peace exactly, but restraint, a covenant this time with all living things. But peace was short-lived. Noah planted a vineyard. drank too much, lay exposed in his tent. One son saw, the others covered him. The cycle resumed, shame, judgment, division. From Noah's sons came the nations, 70 of them listed in names like Echoes, Canaanites, Hittites, Elamites, Philistines, the table of nations mapped out like future battlegrounds. And then Babel, a city of ambition, one language, one speech, one people. They built upward, a tower reaching to heaven, not to worship but to make a name for themselves. Unity, yes, but in defiance. The divine came down, not to destroy but to scatter. Language fractured, nations split, the tower stood incomplete. From the dust of that halted monument came the confusion of tongues. The world turned outward. History branched. The irony is sharp. Humanity tried to reach heaven. Instead, they were grounded. The old world, reset by flood, was already repeating itself. Violence, pride, empire, the raw materials of history. Yet not all was wrath. Embedded in the descent were seeds, a preserved family, a promised rainbow, a confusing mercy, a divine patience, long suffering, letting history play itself out, letting humanity choose again and fail. But something had shifted. The cosmic stage, the Eden dramas, the world-cleansing floods were giving way to a narrower focus. A single man would be called, a single family chosen, not because they deserved it, but because the story needed a new thread. The long descent was nearly over. The long ascent was about to begin. The wind was dry and hot over the land of Shinar. Cities rose like teeth from the plains. Uruk Eridu, great centers of stone, reed, and belief. And yet the man who would become the father of nations was not born in a wilderness tent, but in a place of empire. His name was Abram. Not yet Abraham, not yet a patriarch, just a man from the city of Ur, a Sumerian metropolis near the banks of the Euphrates. Its ziggurat loomed like a stairway to heaven. Its priests mapped stars and carved tablets. And somewhere, amid the brick streets and crowded markets, this man lived with his father, Terah, in the quiet hum of a polytheistic world. Nothing yet marked him as chosen. He was married to Sarai, who bore no children. In a culture where legacy was everything, he had none. A line without a future. Yet it was from this silence, this void, that a voice came. The text is sparse. It does not describe the sound, only the words. No thunder, no fire, just an imperative. Sudden, cosmic, and ignorable. Go. Leave your country, your people, your father's household. Walk away from everything you know and towards something you cannot yet see, a land I will show you. This is not mythology in the classical sense. There are no dragons, no magic swords, no divine children raised by wolves. There is only a man, an old man, asked to uproot everything on the promise of a future not yet written. And that's what makes it revolutionary. Ancient Near Eastern religions did not encourage this kind of journey. Gods were tied to places, to rivers and temples. You honored the deity of your land, your city. To leave Ur was to leave the gods behind. But this new voice was different. It didn't belong to a local idol. It didn't dwell in stone. It followed you. It called you out. And so at 75, Abram left. He took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot. They took livestock, servants, all they could carry. They headed north along the trade routes through the Fertile Crescent, first to Haran, where Terah died, then further still toward the unknown. This is the hinge of the Old Testament. Everything pivots here. Abram becomes a man suspended between promises and reality. The voice tells him he will become a great nation, that his name will be blessed. And through him, all nations of the earth will be blessed. But the years pass, and there is no child. Sarai remains barren, and Canaan, the land they arrive in, is not empty. It is filled with people, cities, kings. There is a tension, a constant space between what is and what will be, and yet Abram builds an altar, then another. As he travels, he marks the land with acts of faith, stone by stone, calling on the name of the Lord. There is no temple, no written law, only trust in a promise renewed again and again in a God who does not stay in one place. But the world presses in. Famine drives Abram to Egypt, where fear overtakes him. He lies. Says Sarai is his sister to save his life. Pharaoh takes her into his house and is struck by plagues. The first of many Egyptian entanglements in this long story. Abram is rebuked, enriched, and expelled. This is not a tale of perfection. Abram is not a saint. He doubts, he deceives, he wavers, but still the voice returns. Look toward the heavens. Count the stars if you can. So shall your descendants be. It is then that a strange thing happens. Abram believes, and the text says it was credited to him as righteousness. This is not legal righteousness. It's not moral purity. It's deeper, a kind of relational trust that redefines what covenant means. Abram is not just a subject of divine command. He is a partner, a name spoken into cosmic history. The covenant is sealed not with ink, but with ritual. Animals are split in two, a path is cleared. Abram falls into a deep sleep, and in that darkness, a vision, a smoking firepot, a flaming torch passing between the pieces, a sign of binding promise. But with the promise comes a prophecy, that Abram's descendants will be strangers in a land not their own, enslaved, oppressed for 400 years. But afterward, they will come out with great possessions. The land will be theirs. Already the long arc of history is bending forward, through Egypt, through Exodus, through struggle and return. Still the clock ticks. Sarai remains without child, so she takes matters into her own hands. She offers Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to Abram, a surrogate. A child is born, Ishmael. But this is not the child of the promise, not the one whose line would carry the covenant. It is an act of desperation, understandable, human, but not the end of the story. When Abram is 99, the voice returns once more, this time with fire behind it. Walk before me and be blameless. I am El Shaddai. A new covenant is declared, a new name given. Abram becomes Abraham, father of many. Sarai becomes Sarah, princess. Laughter will follow them, because their child, promised for decades, will be named Isaac, meaning he laughs. And as a sign of this renewed promise, a command: circumcision. The covenant marked not on stone but in flesh, a painful, permanent reminder. It is radical even now, a story not of power or conquest but of calling, of a man who believed without seeing, who built altars in foreign lands, who became the root of three great faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And it all begins with a single word: go. Not to a city, not to a throne, but to the unknown, to a land that would take generations to possess, to a promise that seemed, for most of his life, impossible. Abram walked out of Ur and into legend, not because he was perfect, but because he listened. And in listening, he changed the direction of history. The journey continues through dry hills and shifting tents across the lands between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Abraham, once Abram, now walks under a name given by God, a name meaning father of multitudes. But multitudes have not yet come, only promises. Stars in the sky, dust of the earth, visions of descendants stretching far beyond what any eye could count. He walks with Sarah, whose name was also changed, from Sarai to Sarah, princess. She is old, the years of childbearing far behind her. They have wandered long, from Ur to Haran, from Haran to Canaan, down into Egypt, then back again, always moving, always waiting. The land was promised, but they remain strangers in it. The child was promised, but they remain barren. One day, three visitors appear. Men, but not quite men. Abraham runs to meet them, bows low, and offers food, shade, rest. This is the way of the desert. Hospitality is sacred. He prepares a calf, fine bread, milk. They eat under the trees. Then one of them speaks a word that cuts through time. This time next year, Sarah will have a son. She laughs from behind the tent, laughs at the absurdity of it. She is old, her womb is closed, but the visitor hears and asks, "Why did she laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" The year turns. The promise takes flesh. Sarah gives birth to a son and names him Isaac. He laughs, but joy is not pure. Tension simmers under the surface. Before Isaac, there was Hagar. Years before, when hope had faded and Sarah despaired, she had given Abraham her Egyptian servant Hagar to bear a child in her place. Hagar became pregnant and bore Ishmael, whose name means God hears. But once Isaac is born, the old bitterness returns. Sarah sees Ishmael playing and feels a threat in it. She tells Abraham to cast them out, mother and child. Abraham is troubled, but God tells him to listen. Ishmael too will become a nation. So Hagar walks into the wilderness carrying her child. When the water runs out, she sets him down under a bush and walks away, unable to watch him die. But a voice calls from heaven. "What troubles you, Hagar?" God has heard the boy crying. A well appears. Life continues. Ishmael survives. He will become the father of many. His descendants will live in the wilderness, free and wild. Back in Canaan, Isaac grows. He is the child of promise, the miracle son. But one day, Abraham hears another voice. This one darker, heavier. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering." There is no protest, no argument. Abraham rises early, splits wood, saddles the donkey, and walks with Isaac and two servants for 3 days. On the third day, he sees the mountain. He tells the servants to stay behind. Father and son walk on alone. Isaac carries the wood. Abraham carries the fire and the knife. Isaac asks, "Where is the lamb for the offering?" Abraham answers, "God will provide." They reach the place. Abraham builds the altar, lays the wood in order, binds Isaac, and places him on it. He lifts the knife, then a voice, "Abraham! Abraham!" He stops. The angel of the Lord speaks, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know you fear God." A ram is caught in a thicket. Abraham offers it instead. The mountain is named Yahweh-Yireh. The Lord will provide. The test ends, but the scars remain. Isaac is spared, but what passed between father and son in that moment, we are not told. The story moves on, but the silence echoes. Sarah dies in Hebron. Abraham purchases a burial cave, the first piece of land he owns in Canaan. The land is promised, but not yet possessed. Isaac needs a wife. So Abraham sends his servant far back to his kin to find one. The servant prays by a well, and Rebekah appears. She gives water to him and to his camels. The servant sees this as a sign. She agrees to go. Isaac meets her in a field, and she becomes his wife. He loves her. She comforts him after Sarah's death. Abraham dies and is buried beside Sarah. Ishmael returns for the burial. The two sons, separated by tension and exile, meet again at their father's tomb. Their paths diverge once more, but this moment binds them. The legacy continues through Isaac, but the story remains entangled with laughter, with exile, with sacrifice. Fathers carry promises, strangers carry burdens. The land remains distant, the fulfillment incomplete. And yet the story moves forward, not cleanly, not quickly, but deeply, through jealousy and faith, through barrenness and blessing, through foreign lands and silent altars. This is the story of a family becoming a people, of names changed by divine breath, of covenants that reach through generations. of tears in the wilderness and wells that open when all hope seems lost. Isaac will father 2 sons. They will wrestle, deceive, and dream. The pattern of promise and peril continues, but the foundation is here, the tent, the altar, the mountain. The God of Abraham is not a God of distance. He enters into the mess of family, the ache of waiting, the sharpness of testing. He walks with wanderers, speaks in fire and silence, watches over sons of promise and sons of exile. He is found in the welcome of strangers, in the crack of dry earth splitting to reveal water, in the voice that stops the knife, in the long pause between laughter and grief. This is not myth polished for comfort. It is raw, restless, unresolved. It moves like wind over the tents, like dust underfoot, like a whisper that cannot be pinned down. Yet through it all, the promise remains, the land, the descendants, the blessing for all nations. You are meant to remember Hagar, to remember the wilderness, to remember Sarah's laughter, Isaac's eyes, Abraham's silence as he raised the blade. These are not ornaments, they are the bones of the story. And so the journey continues, not forward but downward, into struggle, into dreams, into deception. The next chapter begins where every family begins, with brothers Jacob, Esau, the ladder to heaven, wrestling with God, becoming Israel. Jacob's story begins in the womb, not with a cry but a struggle. He fights his brother before he's even born. Esau comes out first, red and hairy, wild like the earth. But Jacob follows, gripping his brother's heel. His name means grasper, but it also means supplanter, and that's exactly what he becomes. Their father, Isaac, is old, quiet, a bridge between giants. Abraham before him, Jacob after, a man of fewer words, more silence. Their mother, Rebekah, sees something in Jacob, a divine whisper maybe, a scheme, certainly. Esau is favored by Isaac, a hunter, a man's man. Jacob prefers tents and thinking. It's an old story, brawn and instinct versus wit and cunning. But the stakes here are ancestral, eternal. One day, Esau returns from the field starving. Jacob has stew, red lentils, the color of blood, and promises. "Sell me your birthright," Jacob says. Esau shrugs. He's hungry now. What good is legacy to a dying stomach? He agrees. And with that, a sacred inheritance shifts. But Jacob doesn't stop there. When Isaac is near death, nearly blind, he calls Esau for a final blessing, the one that can't be taken back. Rebekah moves fast. She dresses Jacob in goatskins to mimic Esau's hairy arms. She prepares game the way Isaac likes it. Jacob walks in, voice shaking, hands trembling. Isaac is suspicious, but time and frailty win out. The blessing is spoken. Nations, power, divine favor, a mantle of destiny. And when Esau returns, it's too late. He weeps, not just for the lost words, but for the chasm they open between brothers. Esau swears he'll wait until Isaac dies. Then Jacob will pay. So Jacob runs to his uncle Laban, across the wilderness, alone with nothing but a stone for a pillow and fear pressing on every side. That night, something breaks open. In a dream, he sees a ladder stretching from earth to heaven, angels ascending and descending. At the top, God. The same voice that spoke to Abraham now speaks to him. "I am with you. I will not leave you." The promise travels down the family tree. Jacob wakes, heart pounding. He names the place Bethel, house of God, not a temple, not a throne, a dusty patch of earth where the infinite touched the finite, a reminder, even liars and schemers can be chosen, even fugitives can dream. He keeps walking. When Jacob meets Laban, it's like staring into a mirror, older, more practiced in the game. Laban has 2 daughters, Leah, the elder, and Rachel, the beautiful. Jacob falls for Rachel instantly, works 7 years to marry her. The wedding comes, the veil stays on, the wine flows, and in the morning, Laban laughs it off. Finish this week and I'll give you Rachel too, for 7 more years. So Jacob agrees, deceived but still playing. This time the trickster has been tricked. Years pass, sons are born, 12 in all, from 4 women, Leah, Rachel, and their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. The family grows into a nation in seed form. Jealousies boil. Love fragments. Rachel, barren for years, finally bears Joseph, Jacob's favorite, a child of memory and longing. Jacob outwits Laban in livestock breeding. His flocks multiply, his wealth grows, but tension rises. Time to go home. He sends messages to Esau, gifts, peace offerings, but the reply is chilling. Esau is coming with 400 men. Jacob panics. He divides his camp, hedges his losses. Then, on the eve of reunion, he stays behind, alone again, as before, but this time, someone grabs him. In the darkness, they wrestle. No names, no words, just flesh, dust, breath, all night. Jacob refuses to let go. At dawn, the being touches his hip. It dislocates. Still, Jacob clings. "Bless me," he says, and the being does. "You will no longer be called Jacob but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." Israel means wrestles with God, not praises, not obeys, wrestles. The name is not a prize, it's a scar. The blessing leaves him limping. The next day, he sees Esau, approaches slowly, bowing 7 times, but Esau runs to him, embraces him, weeps. Years of hate dissolve in a single moment. Forgiveness, unspoken and total. 2 brothers, finally at peace, or as close as their stories allow. Jacob continues on, builds altars, buries idols, tries to settle, but tragedy never stays far. His daughter Dinah is violated in Shechem. Her brothers Simeon and Levi avenge her in fury. Slaughtering the city, Jacob is horrified. Not at their vengeance, but at what it invites. The fragile peace with surrounding tribes is gone. Blood brings more blood. Rachel dies, giving birth to Benjamin. Her grave becomes a monument of grief. Isaac dies. Jacob returns to Hebron. The family circle closes. Almost. The story shifts now. The spotlight begins to fall on Joseph, the dreamer, the favorite, the son of Rachel. But Jacob, now Israel, has lived many lives. He has been the deceiver and the deceived, the fugitive and the father. He has seen ladders in dreams and angels in disguise. He has wrestled in the night and limped into the dawn. His story teaches not perfection, but transformation. That faith is not a straight line, but a struggle, and that sometimes the greatest blessings leave bruises. Joseph was 17 when the fracture revealed itself. He was the favored son of Jacob, chosen, born late in his father's life. The firstborn of Rachel. His brothers knew it. They saw it in the way Jacob looked at him. They felt it in the way Jacob spoke of him, and they could not miss it in the gift. A long robe with sleeves, a coat of many colors, a symbol not just of affection, but of distinction. He was marked. Joseph dreamed. And then he spoke. He told his brothers of sheaves of grain, theirs bowing to his. He told them of the sun, moon, and stars, all bending toward him. The dreams may have been innocent. They struck like daggers. Even Jacob rebuked him, yet kept the matter in mind. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers in the fields. They saw him from a distance, the bright coat flashing under the sun. They conspired. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Let's kill him. We'll see what becomes of his dreams." Reuben intervened. "Don't shed blood," he said. "Throw him into a pit." Reuben meant to rescue him later, But once Joseph was stripped of his coat and lowered into the dry cistern, Reuben disappeared. The others sat to eat. Then came the caravan. Ishmaelites bound for Egypt, camels loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. Judah saw a new path. What profit is there in killing him? Let's sell him. They lifted Joseph from the pit and sold him for 20 shekels of silver, a life traded for coins. They dipped his coat in goat's blood and brought it back to Jacob. He saw the torn fabric stained dark. A wild beast has devoured him, he said. He tore his clothes and mourned. He would not be comforted. Joseph, meanwhile, was taken to Egypt and sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. Joseph served well. Everything he touched prospered. Potiphar saw it and gave him charge over his household. But Potiphar's wife saw Joseph too. She desired him. He refused. Day after day she pressed. One day she caught him by the cloak. He fled, leaving the garment in her hand. She used it to accuse him. Potiphar believed her and threw Joseph into prison. Even there the pattern repeated. Joseph found favor. The keeper of the prison entrusted him with everything. And again, dreams returned. 2 officials of Pharaoh, the cupbearer and the baker, each had dreams they could not interpret. Joseph listened. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" he asked. He told the cupbearer his dream meant restoration. He told the baker his dream meant death. Both came true. Joseph asked the cupbearer, "Remember me when it goes well with you." But the man forgot. 2 years passed. Then Pharaoh dreamed. He stood by the Nile. 7 sleek cows rose from the river. Then 7 thin, gaunt cows followed and devoured the first. He awoke. He dreamed again. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were swallowed by 7 withered ones. None of Pharaoh's magicians could explain it. Then the cupbearer remembered. Joseph was summoned. He bathed, shaved, changed clothes. Pharaoh told him the dreams. Joseph answered, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. The 7 good cows and ears mean 7 years of plenty. The 7 lean cows and withered ears mean 7 years of famine. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." He advised appointing someone wise to oversee storage during the years of plenty. Pharaoh saw wisdom in him and made him second over all Egypt. From pit to palace, Joseph was 30 years old. He traveled across Egypt collecting grain during the years of abundance, storing it in great silos. Then came the famine. It struck not only Egypt, but also Canaan. Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt and sent 10 of his sons to buy. Only Benjamin, Rachel's other son, remained behind. Joseph saw them. They bowed before him, not recognizing their brother. He spoke through an interpreter and accused them of being spies. They protested, saying they were 12 brothers. 1 gone, 1 left behind. Joseph held Simeon hostage and sent the rest back, instructing them to bring Benjamin if they wanted more grain. Unknown to them, he returned their silver in their sacks. Jacob refused to send Benjamin, but the famine worsened. Judah took responsibility. "Should I fail to return him to you, may I carry that burden for all time." They came back. On this occasion, Joseph laid out a grand meal for them. He arranged their seating by birth order. Benjamin received portions 5 times greater than his brothers. Their eyes grew wide with surprise, yet they continued eating. Joseph designed a test for them. He concealed his silver cup inside Benjamin's bag. When they departed, he dispatched his men to catch up with them. The cup was discovered. The brothers ripped their garments in anguish. They made their way back to Joseph. Judah came forward. He recounted the entire story once more, from their father Jacob's grief to the vow he had sworn. "Allow me to take the boy's place as your servant. How could I possibly face my father without the boy at my side?" Joseph reached his breaking point. He ordered the room cleared and broke down in tears. "I am Joseph," he declared. "Does my father still live?" The brothers stood frozen in shock. He came closer to them. Do not trouble yourselves with guilt. God placed me here ahead of you to save lives. Your intentions were harmful, but God transformed them for good. He held them close. Pharaoh learned of this reunion and received them warmly. Wagons were dispatched. Jacob, shaking with anticipation, traveled to Egypt and was reunited with his son. "I'm ready to die now that I have looked upon your face." 17 years went by. When Jacob's final days approached, he spoke blessings over his sons, giving each one words that spoke of their future. He blessed the sons of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh, adopting them as his very own. His death came in Egypt, yet his burial took place in Canaan within the cave of Machpelah, next to Abraham and Isaac. Following his death, Joseph's brothers grew fearful of retribution. They delivered a message to him. "Our father commanded this before he died. We ask you to forgive your brothers." Joseph wept upon hearing this. He gave them reassurance once again. "Your plans were meant to cause harm. God used those plans to preserve many lives." Joseph witnessed 3 generations of his descendants. Before his final breath, he spoke to his family, saying, "God will surely visit you and carry you from this land to the land of his promise." He required them to make an oath that they would transport his bones when they left Egypt. Then Joseph's life ended. They prepared his body for burial. He was laid to rest in a coffin in Egypt. The narrative of the patriarchs concludes in a land not their own. What started with a covenant in Canaan now rests in a tomb beside the Nile's waters. Yet the promise remains alive. The bones lie waiting. The dream moves forward. The land had undergone change. Generations had come and gone since Joseph shed tears over his brothers in Pharaoh's palace, since the famine that drove Jacob's sons to Egypt, since those extended years when they lived as honored visitors, given the territory of Goshen and room to grow in safety. But time erases memories, and old alliances fade quickly in the corridors of power. The Hebrews had originally arrived seeking sustenance. Now they served as the builders of empire. A new pharaoh had assumed power, one who, as scripture records, did not know Joseph. Whether this stemmed from deliberate ignorance or genuine historical forgetfulness matters little. This pharaoh viewed the Israelites not as relatives of a national savior, but as a danger. Too numerous, too different, too prolific. The Nile Delta overflowed with their presence, and their numbers were beginning to match those of native Egyptians. Therefore, Pharaoh acted as rulers frequently do when fear overcomes wisdom. He made them slaves. The Israelites found themselves forced into labor, constructing storage cities such as Pithom and Ramesses. They were driven to manufacture bricks without pause. The mud they formed dried under an unforgiving sun, while their bodies were crushed beneath the burden. This went beyond simple labor. It was national suppression through exhaustion, tyranny disguised as civic responsibility. But the plan produced the opposite result. The greater their oppression, the more their numbers increased. The harder Egypt bore down, the more Israel expanded. Pharaoh attempted something more sinister. He called for the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and issued an order. If a male child is born, kill him. If the baby is female, allow her to survive. This quiet directive represented slow extermination, a method to eliminate a people, one newborn at a time. But the midwives feared something more powerful than Pharaoh. They allowed the boys to live. When questioned, they presented a clever explanation. "Hebrew women are strong," they explained. "They deliver before we can reach them." The tyrant strangely accepted this. But the policy changed. Now it became an open decree. Every son born to the Hebrews must be cast into the Nile. And into that river of death, a certain child came into the world. His mother concealed him for 3 months. When hiding him became impossible, she wove a basket from papyrus reeds, sealed it waterproof with pitch, and placed her child adrift in the very river intended to destroy him. He drifted between reeds and ripples, between condemnation and grace. His sister Miriam kept watch from nearby. Then the unthinkable occurred. Pharaoh's daughter arrived to bathe at the river. She noticed the basket, lifted the lid, and the infant cried out. The princess recognized what he was, a Hebrew baby, but something inside her softened. Perhaps it was the helplessness of a weeping child. Perhaps a silent defiance against her father's brutality. Whatever the reason, she claimed him for herself. Miriam approached, thinking quickly, showing courage, and proposed finding a wet nurse. And so the child returned to his birth mother, nursed under royal safeguarding, and raised in the very palace that had decreed his death. They called him Moses, meaning drawn out of the water. He matured between two realities, Hebrew by bloodline, Egyptian by training, a child of the enslaved raised as royalty. He learned the empire's language, the protocols of court, the wisdom of Egypt's religious leaders and scholars. But something within him retained memory, or perhaps something within him never lost it. One day, having reached adulthood, Moses witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew worker. The injustice erupted inside him. He struck the Egyptian, whether intentionally or in panic. The man collapsed, dead. Moses buried the body in sand. News spread. Pharaoh discovered what happened. And this time, royal protection would not save him. Moses escaped eastward into the wilderness, across the northern reaches of the Red Sea, into Midian, untamed country, shepherd's territory. He traded fine garments for rough cloth and robes, gold for a shepherd's staff. There he married Zipporah, daughter of a Midianite priest, and dwelt among tents, sheep, and quietness. Years passed by. Then came the fire. One day, while Moses tended his flock near Mount Horeb, he observed it. A bush ablaze but not burning up, flame without ashes, fire consuming nothing. He turned to investigate. A voice spoke from within the flames. "Moses, Moses." And his response came, "Here I am. Remove your sandals," the voice instructed, "for the ground where you stand is holy." The voice identified itself, not a deity of wood or carved stone, not one of Egypt's gods with animal heads. "I am the God of your ancestors," it declared, "the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses covered his face. Then came the assignment. "I have witnessed the suffering of my people in Egypt." The voice said, "I have heard their cries of anguish. I understand their pain, and I have descended to rescue them." Moses must have felt a surge of vindication until he heard the next part. "I am sending you to Pharaoh to lead my people out." Moses drew back. "Who am I to approach Pharaoh?" The voice responded, "I will be with you." Not an affirmation of Moses' capability, a declaration of presence. Still, Moses wavered. What if they question me? Who sent me? What name shall I give them? And the answer arrived slow and mysterious. "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. A name, yet not a name. A presence, an essence, not confined to a single location or shape. A being who simply exists." But Moses continued resisting. What if they refuse to believe me? What if my words fail me? What if they mock me? The voice provided signs. A staff transformed into a serpent. A hand became leprous, then healed again. Water changed to blood. Still Moses pleaded, "Send someone else, anyone else." The voice remained firm, but offered compromise. "Your brother Aaron will be your spokesman, but you must go." And so the shepherd returned to Egypt, staff gripped tight, passed in tow. Back to the land of his origin, the palace gates rose high. Behind them sat the new Pharaoh, different from the one who tried to kill him as an infant, but shaped by the same empire, the same dread. To him, Moses delivered words that would resonate through the ages. "Let my people go." The story of liberation had commenced, but it would not progress swiftly. Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and Egypt would not release its hold without resistance. What came next would be a conflict not of soldiers, but of wonders and consequences. Plagues that destroyed the myth of control, a battle between empire and the unseen. But first, the requirement was stated, and somewhere, among the bricks and broken bodies, hope began to stir. Moses escaped. He had once been Egyptian royalty, raised in Pharaoh's household, trained in the methods of empire. But after killing an Egyptian who had struck a Hebrew slave, he fled not toward glory, but into the wilderness. He abandoned the palaces of authority for the desolate isolation of Midian. There, he became a keeper of sheep. He cared for flocks that belonged to another, married into a priestly family not his own, and stood watch over animals beneath a sky, offering no explanations. For 40 years, silence expanded across the landscape of his existence. Then, one day, everything transformed. He stood near Horeb, the mountain of God. The sheep wandered freely, and Moses with them, until his gaze caught something peculiar, a bush burning yet not being consumed. Flames danced across the branches, but the branches maintained their form. Fire without residue, heat without devastation, a sight that defied the world's logic. He moved closer. A voice called to him from the fire, speaking his name twice. "Moses, Moses," he replied. "Here I am. Come no further. Remove your sandals, for the ground where you are standing is holy." This was not a summons from recollection or imagination. It was not an echo of wishful thinking. It was presence. The voice did not request. It commanded not from cruelty but from truth, and truth requires no permission. "I am the God of your father," the voice went on, "the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." Moses concealed his face. This was not the sort of encounter one could prepare to face. It was older than terror. It was the heaviness of history settling upon a single human being. Then came a disclosure, not of strength, but of purpose. "I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt. I have listened to them crying out. I am troubled by their suffering, so I have come down to deliver them." God had not abandoned them. In the decades of stillness, in the centuries of subjugation, in the cries that seemed to vanish into emptiness, God was observing. Not as a removed spectator, but as one readying to intervene. "I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses became motionless. He possessed no power, no army, no voice the world would honor. "Who am I?" he questioned, "that I should approach Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt?" But the response did not concern him. "I will be with you." It was not an assignment of pride, but of presence. Moses was a container. He was not the flame. He was the bush. Still, Moses overflowed with questions. "Suppose I go to them and declare, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me,' and they ask, 'What is his name?' What shall I answer them?" This was more than seeking information. It was about identity. In Egypt, gods possessed names: Ra, Osiris, Anubis, each bound to a domain, a function, but this voice emerged from fire and mystery. What name could contain it? God said to Moses, "I am who I am. Tell them, I am has sent me to you." Not a title, not a designation, a proclamation of being, existence itself, the one who is, who was, and who will be. A name unformed by time or restriction. Say to the Israelites, "The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall address me from generation to generation." This was the first unveiling of the divine identity. Yahweh, the Tetragrammaton, too sacred to be voiced aloud, too profound to be defined. The name spoke not of shape, but of presence, not of characteristics, but of being. It was the root of all verbs, the foundation of all existence. Then came direction. "Go, assemble the elders of Israel. Tell them what you have witnessed. Tell them freedom approaches. Then go to Pharaoh. Tell him to release the people 3 days into the wilderness to worship. But he will refuse to let you go," God stated, "not unless a mighty hand forces him." This assignment would not be effortless. It would be confrontation. It would be opposition. Pharaoh's heart would be unyielding, but God would not surrender. So I will extend my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders I will demonstrate there. After that, he will permit you to leave. This was not simply the freedom of a people. It was a confrontation between two authorities. Pharaoh, the divine ruler of Egypt, and I am, the voice from the fire, the gods of the Nile against the God of existence, the empire of humanity against the covenant of heaven. Moses still questioned, what if they refuse to believe me? So God granted signs, a staff that would become a serpent, a hand that would become leprous and be restored again, water from the Nile that would become blood. Each miracle, a marker, evidence not of magic but of divine presence operating through the ordinary. Yet Moses hesitated one more time. I am slow of speech and tongue. But God questioned, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who grants sight or makes blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Then came the final instruction. Now go. I will assist you in speaking. I will teach you what to declare. Still, Moses begged, please send someone else. So God appointed Aaron, his brother, to speak. Moses would lead. Aaron would voice. Together they would walk into empire and speak on behalf of eternity. Moses returned home. He requested Jethro, his father-in-law, for permission to depart. He gathered his family. He took the staff in his hand, the same one that would divide waters and call forth plagues. The journey commenced. The desert wind moved around him. He was no longer simply a shepherd. He was now the carrier of a name that could not be erased. He was not merely going to Egypt, he was walking into history. And in the stillness of night, he understood God had descended, not to explain the pain, but to end it. The Nile became red. Frogs invaded every bed and bowl. Gnats rose from the dust like smoke from a battlefield. Egypt, once the empire of order and stone, began to fracture, not under foreign invasion, but under something stranger, something divine. This was not just resistance, it was theater. It was a confrontation, staged not in the name of diplomacy, but in the name of deliverance. Moses, now an elderly man with a desert behind him and a fire in his chest, stood before Pharaoh not once but many times. Each time, the same requirement, let my people go. Not a negotiation, a command. Not from Moses, really, but from the God who named himself I Am, the same God who spoke from a bush that burned but was not consumed, the same God who remembered promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and was now ready to fulfill them. Pharaoh's heart was not just hard. It was calcified by centuries of belief in Egypt's supremacy, in the divine nature of kingship. He was a god, or so he believed. To release a slave population on the command of an invisible deity was not just bad politics, it was sacrilege. It was the unraveling of identity. And so came the plagues. First, the water became blood, not metaphorically. The fish perished. The air thickened with decay. The magicians of Egypt attempted to replicate the miracle and succeeded, but only worsened the situation. Pharaoh observed, unmoved. Then frogs. Amphibious invaders filled every crack of daily life, jumping into ovens, beds, bowls, and mouths. The magicians could summon frogs as well, but they could not make them depart. Pharaoh pleaded with Moses to stop it. Moses prayed. The frogs died, and Pharaoh hardened his heart again. Then gnats, dust transformed into wings. The magicians surrendered. "This is the finger of God," they murmured. But Pharaoh's heart again remained firm. Flies next, swarms that darkened the sun, disease spread, livestock collapsed sick. Egyptians began to sweat and stumble under boils. Crops were demolished by hail. What the hail missed, locusts consumed. The gods of Egypt, the gods of the Nile, the sun, fertility, medicine, fell silent. Each plague was not random. It was a targeted assault on Egypt's spiritual infrastructure. Then darkness, 3 days of thick blackness. Not just the absence of light, but the absence of orientation. Even indoors, people could not see one another. Time itself shattered. A slow-motion suffocation of sense and rhythm. For a civilization built on cycles, the flooding Nile, the rising sun, this was a wound to the soul. And still, Pharaoh would not bend until the final plague. The most terrible, the most intimate, the death of the firstborn. Moses warned him quietly, solemnly. At midnight, every Egyptian household would feel the silence. From the palace to the prison, from the cattle in the fields to the baby cradled in a noble woman's arms, this time there would be no insects, no storms, just absence, just breath, leaving without return. But for the Israelites, there was a way. One night, one meal, one ritual to remember forever. A lamb unblemished, slaughtered at twilight, its blood smeared on doorposts with a hyssop branch, roasted meat eaten with bitter herbs and flat bread, no time for the dough to rise. Cloaks on, staffs in hand, shoes tied, ready to flee. The angel would pass over the homes marked with blood. The rest without loss. And so it came. Midnight struck, and Egypt woke to wailing. Not one house untouched. Pharaoh's own son, the heir to the throne, gone. The gods did nothing. The priests were silent, and Pharaoh, shattered, summoned Moses one last time. Go. Not just Moses, all of them. Men, women, children, herds, flocks, the whole nation of slaves walking out of empire under cover of night. Silver and gold in their packs, gifts or payments from terrified neighbors. Centuries of labor now ended in hours. They called it the Exodus, a word that means the way out, but it was also the beginning of something new, a people who had never governed themselves, never marched free, never spoken their own laws. Now they would. But Egypt was not finished. Pharaoh changed his mind again. Grief turned to fury. He assembled his chariots, the pride of Egypt's military, 600 elite war machines. The Israelites, slow and disorganized, were trapped by the sea. Panic. Complaints. Why did you bring us out here to die? Moses stood still, then lifted his staff. The sea divided. Not shallow water, not a trick of tide. Walls of liquid rose on either side, and the people passed through on dry ground. Every step, a declaration, "We will not die, slaves." The Egyptians followed. The chariots roared into the path the Israelites had just cleared. But the sea does not obey kings. It does not respect chariots. The waters returned, and Egypt was silent. This was not just deliverance, it was transformation. A nameless people once defined by servitude now carried the memory of thunder, blood, and water in their bones. They would never forget. Every year they would eat the lamb, tell the story, mark their homes, pass it to their children. Why is this night different from all other nights? Because on this night, history changed. A deity declared solidarity with the oppressed, a God who hears, a God who acts. Not just in smoke and mystery, but in history, through flawed men, through stubborn kings, through blood and bread and fire. And this God was not finished. The wilderness was calling. The sea stood like a wall, not just of water, but of memory, fear, and the old world left behind. The people had left Egypt under cover of night, led by Moses, a man marked by contradiction, Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing, exile by fate. They carried the bones of Joseph. They carried their children. They carried fear behind them. From the dust of Pharaoh's chariots rose like smoke a change of heart, a chase of rage. The most powerful army on earth now bore down on a crowd of freed slaves. Weapons against bare hands, horses against sandals, a nation against a wandering people. They had reached the sea. No boats, no bridges, no way forward. They turned on Moses. Were there not enough graves in Egypt? Did you bring us here to die in the desert? Moses answered, "Not with sword, not with anger, but with silence and raised hands." The staff lifted. The wind howled. The sea did not just part, it was torn open. The waters split, rising like walls, trembling at the command of the invisible. The earth beneath was dry, a path carved by command, not by tide. And so they walked through the sea. Fathers holding sons, mothers gripping daughters, priests, elders, the aged, the young, each one stepping into the unknown. Behind them, Pharaoh saw the path and followed. He did not understand that the path was not his to take. When the last Israelites stepped onto the other side, the walls of water remembered themselves. They closed. The army, the horses, the chariots, all swallowed, not by chaos, but by order. Judgment had a rhythm. Justice had weight. This was not escape, it was birth. In Egypt, they had been called slaves. In the sea, they became something else. A people formed not by blood, not by borders, but by covenant. A nation born in the water and the wilderness. The celebration came in the form of a song. Miriam, sister of Moses, led the women in dance, tambourines shaking in the desert air. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." The song was not about vengeance. It was about survival, not about power, but about presence. They were free. But freedom in the wilderness is not the same as freedom in the land. The desert stretched before them. No cities, no crops, no clear future. A pillar of cloud led them by day, a pillar of fire by night, the visible sign of the invisible guide. They soon discovered that bondage leaves marks deeper than chains. Egypt had shaped their rhythms, their fears, their habits. They longed for the predictability of slavery. They missed the meat, the bread, the structure, even if it came with lashes. They were no longer slaves, but they did not yet know how to be free. 3 days into the journey, thirst came. They found water, but it was bitter. Murmuring rose like smoke. Moses cried out. The water turned sweet. They moved forward. Hunger followed. Bread fell from heaven. Each morning the ground was dusted with a mysterious substance. Manna like flakes of frost, like coriander seed, like the taste of honey and dew. Each family gathered what they needed, no more, no less. It melted with the sun. They called it, "What is it?" For they did not understand, and yet they were fed. Quail came in the evening, meat for the weary, water from rocks, sustenance from silence. The wilderness, though empty, was not absent of God. Yet every provision was met with complaint, every miracle followed by doubt. The people could not yet carry freedom in their minds. They were still chasing the shadow of Egypt. Moses bore the weight of a restless people. Each day brought quarrel, each night brought exhaustion. And yet he pressed on, not as a hero but as a servant, not leading by might but by obedience. They reached the base of Mount Sinai. Thunder shook the ground, lightning split the sky. Smoke wrapped the mountain like a garment, and in that moment, the wilderness shifted. They were not just wanderers, they were called. But that moment was still to come. For now, they stood on the far side of the sea. The journey had begun. They had passed through water. They had left Pharaoh behind. They had no map, only presence, no walls, only stars. No king, only a voice in cloud and flame. And still they walked, not as a crowd, but as a people. It begins with smoke. Mount Sinai rises like a spine of black stone in the wilderness, wrapped in thunderclouds and shrouded in a silence that is almost too heavy to bear. The people of Israel, just months removed from slavery, still blinking in the harsh light of freedom, camp at the foot of this mountain, unaware that the ground beneath them is about to become sacred. Here in the middle of nowhere, they will encounter something older than language, something that speaks not in words, but in fire. The journey from Egypt had already been impossible. Plagues, seas parted by wind, water drawn from rocks. But none of that would compare to what was coming. This was not just escape. It was not just deliverance. This was where a tribe became a people with laws, with order, with a name etched in divine covenant. But first, they had to meet the one who had delivered them. 3 days of preparation. That is what they were given. 3 days to wash their garments, to abstain from intimacy, to purify themselves. A ritual silence crept into the camp. Children played more quietly, eyes turned upward. No one touched the mountain, not even the animals. The boundary had been drawn. Crossing it meant death. And then the morning came. Lightning shattered the sky. Thunder did not roll. It cracked like the earth itself was being torn in two. A trumpet blasted from nowhere, long and shrill. A sound that did not seem to come from human lungs. Smoke poured down the slopes of Sinai, and the entire mountain trembled. Not the people. The mountain. It quaked like something alive, straining to hold back the full weight of what was descending. Moses climbed into the smoke. This was not just a prophetic mountaintop moment. This was not just inspiration or meditation. This was revelation. The Hebrew word for glory, kavod, means weight. At Sinai, the glory of God was heavy, crushing, terrible. And yet somehow it did not destroy. It called. And Moses answered. When he returned, he brought 10 words. Aseret Hadibrot, carved in stone. Commandments, not suggestions. These were not abstract ideas. They were a blueprint for survival, the foundation of covenantal living, the beginning of a society built not on power, but on relationship. The first words are about fidelity. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt. Not a God of distant skies or carved idols, a liberator, a presence with memory. And the demand is simple. No other gods, no images, no reductions of the infinite into stone or wood, no misuse of the name, that unspoken tetragrammaton, too holy to utter, too dense with mystery to define. Then come the human commands. Keep the Sabbath, not just for rest, but as a resistance against endless toil. Honor your parents, not sentimentally, but as a recognition of rootedness, the continuation of story. And then the prohibitions against bloodshed, betrayal, theft, lies, envy. Not because these things are abstractly wrong, but because they fracture the community, because they make a people impossible. But the giving of the commandments was not gentle. The people stood far off, trembling. They begged Moses to speak for them, not God. The voice of the divine had been too much. It was not comforting. It was not even beautiful. It was unbearable. The Israelites, who had watched an empire fall, who had walked between walls of water, were now afraid, terrified, and Moses said something strange. Do not be afraid, for God has come to test you so that the fear of him will be with you, to keep you from sinning. Fear that leads to reverence, reverence that anchors morality, morality that sustains freedom. This was the strange logic of Sinai. What followed was not just law. It was architecture, blueprints for a sanctuary, instructions for an ark to hold the tablets, a tabernacle where holiness could dwell among the people, gold, acacia wood, fine linen, specific colors, exact measurements. The details spilled out like divine poetry. This was not just religious obsession. It was embodiment. The abstract had to become physical. The law needed a home. But while Moses remained on the mountain, something broke below. The people grew impatient. They demanded a God they could see, touch, control. Aaron, Moses' brother, priest-to-be, gave in. Gold earrings melted into a calf, a symbol of power, of fertility, of Egypt. Old habits died hard. Even in freedom, chains lingered. And when Moses returned, tablets in hand, the sight of the calf shattered him. He threw the stones to the ground, breaking the covenant before it could even begin. Punishment followed, a reckoning, but not a final one. The covenant was not dead. Moses pleaded again and again, not just for mercy but for presence. He did not just want forgiveness, he wanted assurance. If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. It was not enough to be led. They needed to be accompanied. So the second set of tablets was carved. And this time, something deeper happened. Moses asked to see God's glory, and in a strange, veiled moment, hidden in a cleft of rock, God passed by. Not in fire or earthquake or thunder, but in words. The Lord, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, not power, character. That was the true revelation. When Moses came down again, his face was glowing, radiant, and the people could not bear to look. He had stood in light too long, seen too much. The covenant was renewed, the tabernacle constructed, the ark placed within the Holy of Holies, and above it, between the wings of the cherubim, a presence settled, cloud by day, fire by night. Not distant, not abstract, near. Sinai was not just a place, it was a turning point, a fusion of heaven and earth, a cosmic marriage. The divine law, given not to angels or sages, but to a tribe of wanderers in the dust. A law, forged in thunder and sealed in patience. And that thunder would echo through prophets, through psalms, through lament and joy, through exile and return. Sinai would be the reference point, the beginning, the mountain where freedom met, obligation and love was defined not by feeling but by fidelity. It was not the end of the journey, but it was the moment that gave the journey its meaning. Moses stood atop the mountain alone, consumed by the presence of God. A cloud of fire and thunder surrounded him, and in the silence the voice of the Almighty spoke. He was given the commandments, etched in stone by the hand of God, a covenant for his people, a law to guide them. Yet far below, the people of Israel waited. Time stretched on. The desert, endless and unforgiving, pressed upon them. Impatience grew, gnawing at their hearts. Moses had been gone too long. Their eyes turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, and the high priest. They demanded a God to lead them, something tangible, something visible. They had forgotten the miracles, the parting of the sea, the manna from heaven, the cloud by day, the fire by night. They had forgotten the promises made to their ancestors. Aaron, though reluctant, yielded to the people's pressure. The golden earrings, necklaces and bracelets were gathered, melted down, and shaped into a calf, an idol familiar to the people from Egypt. As the idol took form, the people shouted in joy, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." The air was thick with celebration and forgetfulness. Music filled the camp, and the people danced wildly, offering sacrifices to the golden calf. Their hearts, once filled with awe and reverence for the God who had freed them from slavery, were now enthralled by the creation of their own hands. The images of Egypt, the gods they had known, returned to them from the mountaintop. Moses' gaze pierced through the smoke and chaos. He could hear the clamor below, the sounds of idolatry, the voices of those he had led out of bondage. A burning anger stirred within him, and the weight of the law in his hands felt like fire. God spoke to Moses. His voice was steady, yet laden with sorrow. "Go down, for your people whom you brought out of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly from the way which I commanded them. They have made for themselves a molded calf, and worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt.'" The words of God pierced Moses like a sword. The people had rejected the covenant, and their rebellion was complete, but God's wrath was not yet spent. "I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation." Moses, standing between his people and the wrath of God, interceded. He pleaded for mercy. "Why should your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, 'He brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people." Moses appealed to the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He reminded God of his covenant, that through these people all the nations of the earth would be blessed. He spoke not as a servant, but as one who had known the heart of God, who had seen his mighty acts and knew his justice and mercy. God listened. "I have pardoned according to your word," he said. Yet the consequences of the people's sin would not be without weight. Moses descended the mountain, the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hands, the commandments inscribed by the finger of God. As he approached the camp, the noise of revelry grew louder. His anger flared, glad as he saw the people dancing and bowing before the golden calf. With a cry of anguish, Moses threw the tablets to the ground. The stones shattered at his feet, the law of God broken as the covenant was violated. With fire in his heart, Moses took the golden calf, burned it, ground it to powder, and scattered it upon the waters. He forced the people to drink the bitter waters, the idols' remnants mingling with their bodies, a symbol of their rebellion. Then Moses stood before the people. His voice rang out, trembling with fury and grief. "Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me." The Levites, his own tribe, responded. They gathered around him, and Moses commanded them to go throughout the camp and strike down the idolaters. About 3,000 people died that day, the weight of their sin falling upon them. Moses returned to the mountain, carrying the broken tablets, pleading once more for the forgiveness of the people. "Oh, this people has committed a great sin, and have made for themselves a god of gold. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, well and good. But if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written." But God responded, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book." The consequences of sin would not be averted by Moses' sacrifice. For the soul who sins shall die, yet God promised to send an angel before the people. And though they would not enter the promised land immediately, he would not abandon them. The Lord spoke to Moses, instructing him to carve 2 new tablets like the first. He would come down again, and the law would be renewed. For 40 days and nights, Moses fasted on the mountain, and God passed before him, proclaiming his name, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth. The divine declaration of mercy and justice echoed through Moses' heart. When Moses descended once again, his face shone with the glory of God. The people, struck by the radiance, could not bear to look at him. Moses covered his face with a veil, but spoke to the people, recounting all that God had revealed. The journey continued, the covenant renewed. The people, though unfaithful, were still chosen. Though the golden calf stood as a painful reminder of their rebellion, the possibility of restoration remained. The journey from sin to redemption was not yet complete. But through the wilderness, the people would learn that God was not only their deliverer, but also their lawgiver, their judge, and their redeemer. They were free, but they were not home. Across the parted sea, into the yawning wilderness, this is where the story slows. The rush of Exodus gives way to the long, dry hush of waiting. The Israelites, newly released from Egyptian captivity, step into a harsh new reality, a barren desert stretching ahead, where each day is a test. Each night, a reminder that liberty is not the same as peace. The wilderness is not punishment, it is formation. This is where a nation is forged from a wandering tribe, where habits of slavery are broken by hunger, silence, and divine instruction. A people used to the lash must now learn to listen, and they are not very good at it. Their first instinct is complaint. They have barely gone 3 days into the desert before the water runs out. At Mara, they find a spring, but the water is bitter, undrinkable. The people murmur against Moses. He cries out to God. A piece of wood thrown into the water makes it sweet. The people drink. Then they move on. The pattern begins. Next, they hunger. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt. They say, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. The irony is sharp. They forget the chains. Remember the food. Freedom feels emptier than bondage. So God answers again, not with anger but with provision. In the evening, quail come enough to eat for all. In the morning, the ground is coated with something thin, flake, like fine as frost. They call it manna, meaning what is it? It tastes like honeyed wafers. Sweet, mysterious enough for each day, but only for one day. If they try to hoard it, maggots and stench by morning, except on the sixth day, then miraculously it keeps a double portion to honor the seventh day. The Sabbath, this is more than sustenance. It is education. God is teaching them to depend, to obey, to rest. A radical notion. Rest as holiness, rest as resistance against the memory of Egypt, where rest was stolen. Here, every week, they pause, they remember. They become more than survivors. They become a people with rhythm, with rituals, with a new relationship to time itself. They journey on. At Rephidim, there is no water again. The people quarrel with Moses. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst. Moses is near breaking. God tells him to strike a rock. He does. Water flows. The place is named Massa and Meribah, testing and quarreling. Still, the people are not alone. They are led by a pillar. Cloud by day, fire by night, a visible presence, a sign that they are not abandoned, even when they feel it. When enemies attack, like the Amalekites, they fight, but not without divine aid. Moses raises his hands on a hilltop. As long as they are lifted, the battle turns in their favor. When he tires, Aaron and Hur hold his arms up. Victory comes, community deepens, leadership grows. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, visits. He sees Moses trying to judge every dispute himself. It is unsustainable. Jethro advises a system: appoint capable, honest men to lead smaller groups to handle minor cases, a hierarchy of responsibility. Moses listens. The burden eases. A new structure is born. Law, governance, order rising from chaos. Then they reach Sinai. They camp at the base of the mountain, wrapped in cloud and lightning. God descends in fire. The people tremble. Moses ascends alone. This time not just commandments, instructions, blueprints for a tabernacle, a portable sanctuary, a tent for the divine presence. This tent will be unlike anything they have seen. Made of gold, acacia wood, fine linen dyed scarlet and blue. Inside, an ark, a mercy seat, cherubim of hammered gold, curtains, clasps, altars, incense, precision and beauty, every item symbolic, every measure exact. This is not just architecture, it is theology in fabric and flame. The tabernacle becomes the center of their camp, their cosmos. The cloud settles over it. When it lifts, they move. When it stays, they stay. God is with them. Not in thunder anymore, but in the still center of their dwelling. But obedience remains fragile. Even after Sinai, the people falter again and again. Moses receives instructions on the mountain for 40 days. And in that span, the people build a golden calf, a false god shaped from their earrings, worshipped in wild revelry. The commandments barely dry, already broken. Trust is fragile, faith is fleeting, yet mercy repeats. Moses intercedes, pleads, fashions new tablets to replace the shattered ones. The covenant is renewed, the presence remains. The people keep walking. Alongside law comes holiness. The books of Leviticus and Numbers unfold a different kind of drama. Not action, but structure. They lay out sacrifices, festivals, purity codes, instructions for priests, rules for blood, for skin, for sex, for food. It is dense, even tedious, but in the heart of it lies a profound claim. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Holiness is not about moral superiority. It is about set-apartness, distinction. The Israelites are to be different in diet, in justice, in mercy. The poor are protected. Debts are forgiven every 7th year. Land is returned in the Jubilee. The foreigner is to be treated with fairness. The memory of slavery must inform their laws forever. Justice becomes sacred. But the wilderness tests more than faith. It tests memory. Each time hardship strikes, the people romanticize Egypt. They forget the bricks, remember the onions. They demand meat, water, comfort. Moses bears their grumbling, growing older, heavier with each step. Even he will falter. Even he will not enter the promised land, but not yet. They are being prepared not just to survive, but to inherit. A land awaits, but it cannot be entered lightly. Not by slaves with the habits of slavery still in their bones. They must become a people of covenant, of memory, of trust. So they wander. 40 years, a whole generation dies off. The wilderness becomes a crucible. Every sunrise, manna appears. Every Sabbath, rest is kept. Every sunrise, they are shaped slowly, steadily into something new. Not just a tribe, a nation. Joshua stood on the banks of the Jordan River, gazing across at the land promised to the descendants of Abraham. The water swelled, fierce and relentless. Yet the future lay beyond it. His task was clear: to lead the Israelites into the land of Canaan, to conquer it, and to fulfill the covenant made with their ancestors. The journey had been long, marked by wandering and trials, but the time had come for them to claim their inheritance. The Israelites had spent 40 years in the wilderness. The older generation, the ones who had been freed from Egypt, had passed away, leaving only their children to inherit the promise. It was Joshua's charge to guide them through this final step. There would be no turning back. As the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant approached the river, a quiet command from God was issued. The waters of the Jordan parted just as they had once parted at the Red Sea. The priests stood firm in the middle, holding the ark aloft, while the people crossed on dry ground. It was a miracle, a repetition of the divine acts of the past. The sight of it strengthened the Israelites' faith, reminding them that the same God who had delivered them from Egypt was still with them, guiding them to their destiny. Once across, Joshua commanded that 12 stones be taken from the riverbed, one for each tribe of Israel. These stones were to serve as a memorial, a symbol of their crossing, and a reminder for future generations of the great things God had done for them. The stones were placed at Gilgal, the first stop in their new land, where the people camped and prepared for the conquest ahead. In the days that followed, the Israelites were reminded of the covenant through circumcision. The new generation, those born in the wilderness, had not yet been circumcised according to the law given to their ancestors. This ritual act of renewal was a symbolic act of purification, marking their commitment to God's promise. It was an outward sign of the internal change required to take possession of the land. God spoke to Joshua once more, giving him specific instructions for the first battle, the city of Jericho. This ancient city, fortified with towering walls, stood in their way. The Israelites had faced many obstacles in their journey, but this would be their first true test of faith in the land. God's plan for the conquest of Jericho was strange, unconventional, and beyond military strategy. Joshua was instructed to march around the city with his army, not once, not twice, but for 6 days. The soldiers were to be silent, not a word to be spoken. The priests were to blow their trumpets, the Ark of the Covenant carried in front of them. The people obeyed, though it must have seemed odd. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times. At the final trumpet blast, the walls of Jericho would collapse. For 6 days, the Israelites followed the divine command without question. Each day, they walked silently around and around, while the people of Jericho watched from behind their walls. It must have seemed like a strange ritual, one that held no logical reason. Yet, the people did not waver. They trusted in God's promise, even when his plan made no sense from a military standpoint. On the 7th day, the Israelites marched around the city 7 times. Shewuden Ashesenfen. When that final trumpet call rang out, the mighty walls surrounding Jericho came tumbling down, collapsing into rubble and dust. A tremendous victory had been achieved without drawing even a single blade. This triumph came through unwavering faith and complete obedience to the Lord. The Israelite forces surged forward, taking control of the city. However, they had received strict instructions to utterly destroy everything they found inside, making an exception only for Rahab, the woman who had sheltered the Israelite scouts previously. Her belief had rescued both her and her loved ones. Jericho lay in complete ruins, bringing them one step nearer to claiming the land as their own. Yet the conquest of Jericho carried consequences that would soon become apparent. Like any significant triumph, difficulties were certain to emerge afterward. The community received a stern warning against taking any plunder for personal gain, since all the precious metals and treasures belonged to God alone. Despite this, Achan, a member from Judah's tribe, secretly claimed some of these forbidden items, concealing them inside his dwelling. His act of defiance would bring about devastating results. As the Israelites advanced toward their next target, the smaller settlement of Ai, they anticipated another straightforward victory. Instead, they suffered an unexpected defeat, with 36 warriors losing their lives in combat. Joshua, overwhelmed with distress, prostrated himself before the Lord, desperately asking why the Israelites had been struck down in battle. The Lord disclosed to him Achan's transgression, the stolen goods, and how this had corrupted the entire camp. Achan's wrongdoing was exposed, and both he and his household were executed by stoning, serving as a stark warning to everyone else. After this sin had been removed from among them, the Israelites returned to Ai and conquered it completely. The community absorbed a crucial lesson about obedience and maintaining purity. They came to understand that their military successes weren't guaranteed simply through their own might, but rather through their loyalty to God's instructions. The Israelites pressed on with their military operations, and gradually the various cities throughout Canaan fell before them. Every conquest moved them closer toward their ultimate objective, while simultaneously testing their devotion, their cohesion, and their dedication to the divine. They were discovering that the territory wouldn't simply be handed over to them. They would need to battle for every portion of it. Yet they were far from alone in this struggle. The same God who had divided the Red Sea and halted the Jordan's flow remained beside them at every turn, directing their movements and guiding them toward victory after victory. Still, amid all these conquests, an underlying strain persisted. The territory they were working to claim already had inhabitants, the Canaanites, and the confrontations with these populations were frequently savage. The Israelites were commanded to expel them in order to possess the land that belonged to them by divine decree. As the warfare continued, the harsh realities of combat became increasingly apparent. The destruction of both Jericho and Ai represented merely the opening chapter. Many more conflicts awaited them, each presenting unique challenges in different ways. For the present moment, however, the Israelites had experienced the sweetness of victory. Jericho's walls had crumbled, and their faith had received its reward. The promised territory was nearly within their reach. Looking ahead toward what lay before them, they recognized that the journey was nowhere near completion. Additional obstacles would arise, further battles would be fought, and more periods of uncertainty would test them. Even so, the memory of Jericho, that victory achieved through complete trust in the divine, would stand as a guiding light of hope, leading them onward through whatever came next. Following Joshua's death, there existed no monarch, no royal authority, no unified leadership. Only scattered tribes spread throughout Canaan like grain scattered across the ground. Each possessed its own chieftains, its own territorial boundaries, its own deities, murmuring through the fractures in their faith. The Israelites had indeed entered the promised territory, yes, but the land remained untamed, uncultivated, filled with foreign places of worship and lingering adversaries. The conquest had been incomplete, the victories remained unfinished. Now, lacking a powerful leader to provide direction, the community began to lose its way. The Book of Judges begins not with celebration, but with a gradual unraveling of what had been achieved. The tribes failed to completely expel the remaining Canaanite strongholds from the land. Pagan places of worship endured, marriages between peoples commenced. Foreign idols made their return. No definitive boundary existed separating the chosen from the conquered populations. Religious devotion grew increasingly weak. Collective memory began to fade away. Into this disorder, a recurring pattern emerged, much like ocean waves repeatedly crashing against the shoreline. The community forgot the sacred agreement they had made. They turned their devotion toward other deities. Baal and Asherah, names spoken in sacred groves and elevated places of worship. Fertility deities, rain deities, the type you could physically see and touch and present offerings to. Yahweh, unseen and requiring much, became simple to disregard. Then, inevitably, oppression arrived. An invading monarch, a foreign military force, a harsh hand pressing down upon their necks. Only then, when the suffering became too much to bear, did the Israelites call out, finally remembering the God of Sinai. From the dust and desperation, a rescuer would emerge. A judge, not a figure in courtroom robes, but rather a fighter, a prophet, a tribal champion, someone chosen for one specific purpose: deliverance. The enemy forces would be vanquished, a period of peace would follow. But peace never endured for long. The judge would die, and the people would forget once more. This became the cycle that repeated endlessly. Sin, followed by oppression, then repentance, then deliverance, then peace, and returning again to sin. A wheel, spinning continuously, wearing down the vision of a righteous nation. Othniel emerged as the first deliverer, a distant kinsman of Caleb, that aged warrior from Joshua's era. The scriptural account is concise. He freed them from a Mesopotamian ruler and governed during peacetime. Soon enough, however, the cycle turned once more. Ehud came next, a left-handed warrior from Benjamin's tribe. His account is peculiar and sharp-edged. The adversary was Eglon, Moab's king. Ehud concealed a blade against his right upper leg, precisely where no guard would think to inspect. He secured a private meeting with the monarch, declaring he carried a confidential message, then drove the weapon deep into the corpulent tyrant's abdomen. The text dwells on the details, carrying an almost darkly humorous tone. The layers of fat enveloped the blade's handle completely, bodily waste spilled forth. Ehud made his escape, while the palace guards assumed their ruler was simply using the latrine. The Moabite forces were thoroughly routed. Israel could breathe freely again. Next appeared Deborah, the sole female judge, a woman who spoke God's words. She conducted her affairs beneath a palm tree, dispensing wisdom, while her military commander Barak wavered about entering battle unless she accompanied him. United, they confronted Sisera, who commanded a Canaanite army equipped with 900 iron war chariots. Against every expectation, they achieved victory. The enemy commander fled on foot, only to be drawn into a tent by Jael, a woman who appeared entirely harmless. She offered him milk to drink. He fell asleep. Then she hammered a tent stake completely through his temple. The cycle repeated itself yet again. Gideon arose in the following generation, an unwilling hero, threshing grain in secrecy to avoid the Midianites. An angelic being addressed him as a mighty warrior. Gideon responded with skepticism. He considered himself the most insignificant man from the most insignificant clan. Nevertheless, he followed the call. He demolished his father's altar dedicated to Baal. He assembled an army for battle, yet Yahweh reduced its size dramatically. Too many soldiers, the Lord declared. Victory must clearly be divine in origin, not human achievement. Gideon's forces were whittled down to 300 men. Equipped with ram's horns, burning torches, and clay containers, they surrounded the enemy encampment during the night hours, shattered their vessels, sounded their horns, and raised a battle cry. Confusion spread rapidly through the camp. The enemy forces slaughtered one another in the darkness and confusion. Gideon achieved victory. Peace followed once more. Yet even Gideon wasn't without moral compromise. He declined the crown when offered, proclaiming that God alone was king. However, he gathered gold from the spoils, fashioned an ephod, and established a shrine for it. The community came to worship there. Another seed of false worship had been planted. After Gideon's death, one of his sons, Abimelech, proclaimed himself monarch. Regardless of propriety, he murdered his brothers, establishing himself as a self-appointed tyrant. His reign concluded in violence and flames, crushed when a woman dropped a millstone from a tower onto him. The cycle faltered. Violence bred only more violence in return. Jephthah emerged next, the rejected son of a prostitute. Cast out from his home, he became a raider, leading a band of outlaws. When Ammonite forces posed a threat, the elders pleaded for his return. He consented on the condition that he would govern them, following victory. Prior to engaging in battle, he made an impulsive vow. Should God grant him victory, he would sacrifice whatever first greeted him upon his return home. He emerged victorious. When he arrived home, his daughter, his only offspring, ran out to welcome him, dancing with pure joy. The scriptural account carries haunting ambiguity. She requested 2 months to grieve her situation. Afterward she returned, and the vow was carried out to completion. Then came Samson. He differed completely from any judge who came before, a Nazirite from the moment of birth. No wine permitted, no razor could touch his hair, no contact with the dead. His strength defied natural explanation. He slaughtered Philistines using nothing but a donkey's jawbone, tore city gates from their hinges, set foxes ablaze as living torches. Yet he also proved impulsive, arrogant, ensnared by women. His doom was written from the very beginning. Delilah the temptress wore down his resistance. She sheared his hair away. The Philistines blinded him, bound him in chains, subjected him to mockery. In the final moments, his strength returned one last time. He brought down the support pillars of their temple, burying himself along with his enemies. A tragic deliverer, driven more by rage than genuine faith. Throughout the book of Judges, a gradual descent unfolds. Each successive deliverer carried slightly greater flaws. Each narrative grew increasingly chaotic. The concluding chapters don't even feature judges at all, only horrifying events. A Levite traveling with his concubine, a brutal assault during the night in Gibeah, a corpse dismembered into pieces, a civil war waged against Benjamin's tribe. The nation nearly destroyed itself completely. The final verse captures everything. During those days, no king ruled in Israel. Each person did whatever seemed right in their own estimation. It marked a grim conclusion to a grim era. The people inhabited the land, yet the promise was slipping through their fingers. Covenant existed without kingdom, faith existed without memory, law existed without genuine love. The judges arrived and departed like successive waves, each one crashing with greater force than the one before. The cycle proved unsustainable. Something had to break. The longing became unmistakable now. Not merely for peace, but for something permanent, for a monarch, for established structure, for someone capable of keeping the wheel steady when the people began to spin out of control. That too, however, would carry its own cost. The people of Israel had endured lengthy governance under judges. These were individuals, both men and women, selected by God to provide guidance for his people, leading them through repeated cycles of transgression, divine punishment, repentance, and rescue. Now the people observed the surrounding nations. They witnessed kingdoms with their monarchs, their royal courts, their organized armies. They desired the same thing. They wanted to resemble the other nations. It wasn't that the judges had proven themselves failures. Rather, the people wanted something more. Greater stability, stronger unity, increased power. They no longer placed trust in the invisible God. They needed a king they could actually see, someone capable of leading them into military conflict, someone who could unite them during both peaceful times and periods of war. They wanted to be just like everyone else. Samuel, Israel's final judge, felt deeply troubled. He had served with complete faithfulness, providing wise guidance to the people, yet the people's demand rang clear. They wanted a monarch. In their thinking, a king would strengthen them. A king would grant them significance. A king would provide the security they craved. Samuel, however, understood what a king would truly bring. He issued warnings, speaking with complete honesty, yet they refused to listen. The monarch would impose taxes upon them, draft their sons into military service, and compel their daughters into servitude. The king would claim their finest land and their best harvests. They would find themselves ruled by a mere man, exactly as the nations surrounding them experienced, a man who would enjoy luxurious living while they labored for his benefit. A king would possess power, and power has a corrupting influence. The people, nonetheless, stood firm in their resolve. "We want a king," they cried out in unison. Samuel, heavy with sorrow, approached God in prayer. God answered him, "They haven't rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. They don't want me to reign as their king. Grant them what they're asking for, but make certain they understand the consequences." And Samuel did exactly that. He assembled the people together and described to them the king's ways of operating. Still, they refused to change their minds. Their determination was absolute. With a heart weighed down by grief, Samuel anointed Saul, the son of Kish from Benjamin's tribe. Saul stood as a man of impressive physical stature, tall and handsome in appearance, a warrior capable of inspiring confidence in others. He appeared every bit the part of a king, yet even as Samuel poured the consecrated oil over his head, the question remained lingering. Was Saul genuinely the man Israel required? Saul's reign started with great promise. He gathered the scattered tribes together, fought back against the Philistines successfully, and brought the people together under his leadership. However, as time passed, fractures started becoming visible. Saul's confidence began to waver, and his obedience toward God started to falter. His pride, his compelling need to maintain control, began to eclipse the humility that had once been his greatest strength. One of his earliest significant failures occurred when God commanded him to utterly destroy the Amalekites, to eliminate them completely from the earth as divine judgment for their transgressions. Yet Saul, in his presumptuous arrogance, chose to spare Agag, their king, and preserve the finest livestock from the Amalekites. He rationalized this to himself as providing animals for sacrificial offerings to God. When Samuel confronted him directly, Saul offered numerous excuses, but Samuel remained unmoved. "Obedience is far better than sacrifice," he declared, announcing that God had now rejected Saul as king. The burden of Saul's disobedience crushed down upon him, yet he continued clinging desperately to the throne. In the years following, Saul's reign continued its downward spiral. He grew intensely jealous of David, the young shepherd boy whom Samuel had anointed to become his successor. David had captured the hearts of the people by defeating Goliath the giant and leading Israel successfully in numerous battles. Saul, consumed entirely by envy, actively sought to kill David repeatedly, pursuing him relentlessly across the wilderness, attempting to eliminate the man he believed posed a threat to his crown. David, despite having multiple opportunities to kill Saul, consistently refused to bring harm to God's anointed one. He showed honor to Saul as king, even while Saul relentlessly pursued his life. The relationship between Saul and David embodied tragic irony. Saul's unhealthy obsession with maintaining his own power drove him toward his downfall. Meanwhile, David's humility and complete trust in God guaranteed his eventual rise to power. David's story, however, wasn't simply one of easy triumph. The transition of power from Saul to David was characterized by considerable bloodshed and civil war, as different factions within Israel fought to gain control. Even after David received his anointing to become king, those who remained loyal to Saul's house resisted. It was far from a smooth, peaceful transition of authority. Yet in the end, David was established as king over all of Israel, and the people celebrated with great joy. The shift from governance by judges to rule by kings represented a pivotal turning point in Israel's historical narrative. The people, previously united under God's direct guidance alone, now possessed a human king to provide leadership. They had desired a king to provide them with security. Instead, they discovered that the burden of power proved heavy indeed. Saul's reign, though beginning with considerable promise, ultimately served as a cautionary tale. It stood as a reminder that the human heart, when left unchecked by divine accountability, could tumble into pride and willful disobedience. The people's desire for a monarch had represented a rejection of God's direct authority over them. In the kings who came afterward, both their successes and their failures would reveal the intricate complexity of human nature. Before kings held power, there were judges who governed. Before kingdoms were established, there were scattered tribes. Before Israel's songs echoed through temple courtyards, there existed only a boy carrying a sling, standing alone against a giant warrior. David was not Israel's first king. That distinction, if one could truly call it that, belonged to Saul, tall and physically imposing, the man the people demanded when they grew weary of prophets and priests providing guidance. Saul served as a lesson in what not to do. David, however, would become the enduring story. He was Jesse's 8th son, a shepherd boy from Bethlehem, the smallest one who didn't even get included in the initial lineup when Samuel arrived to anoint the next chosen leader. God spoke to the prophet, saying, "Appearance doesn't matter, but rather the heart does." So the consecrated oil flowed over David's head, while his older brothers stood there watching, completely astonished. The anointing, though, didn't bring immediate glory with it. David went back to tending the fields. The crown, much like destiny itself, would require patience. When Saul's inner being began fragmenting under the crushing weight of divine rejection, David received a summons. Not to rule, but rather to bring comfort. With his harp, he soothed the troubled king's tormented soul. Music became his first form of weaponry. He would discover early on just how closely violence and beauty could exist side by side. Soon enough, however, music transitioned to warfare. The Philistines possessed a champion warrior. Goliath from Gath, a giant covered in bronze armor, positioned himself in the valley and challenged Israel to send forth a man to fight him. They sent a boy instead. David rejected Saul's armor when offered. It simply didn't fit properly. Instead, he selected 5 smooth river stones, and with just one of them, he ended Goliath's reign of intimidation. Not with a traditional sword, but with remarkable precision and accuracy. Just like that, the shepherd transformed into a legend. He became a military commander, a poet, a celebrated hero. The people composed songs praising him. Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. It was intended as a compliment. It sounded more like a threat to Saul's authority. Saul felt it deep in his bones. From that precise moment forward, David was no longer merely a servant. He had become a hunted fugitive. What followed wasn't a rapid ascent to power, but rather a prolonged descent into shadow and hiding. David fled into the barren wilderness. He took shelter in caves. He pretended to be insane in enemy territories. He gathered outcasts and hired soldiers around him. He spared Saul's life on 2 separate occasions when revenge would have been far easier to take. He grieved the king's decline even while preparing himself to take his place. The wilderness refined his character. The songs he composed during those difficult years continue echoing through the Psalms to this day. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That wasn't mere metaphor or poetry. It was lived memory, genuine experience. Saul's ending proved tragic in nature. Wounded severely in battle against the Philistines, the once-chosen king fell upon his own blade. Jonathan, David's dearest friend and Saul's own son, fell alongside him in battle. When the news reached David's ears, he didn't celebrate at all. He wept openly. He tore his garments in mourning. He composed a funeral song titled, "How the Mighty Have Fallen." It was pure grief, without any trace of gloating or triumph. David didn't immediately seize the throne for himself. The kingdom didn't roll out any welcoming carpet. Civil war simmered beneath the surface. Saul's house still maintained claimants to power. For 7 full years, David ruled exclusively over Judah, his own tribal territory, governing from Hebron. Yet time and gradual attrition accomplished what swords alone could not. Eventually, all the tribes assembled together and proclaimed David king over all of Israel. The shepherd now held the crown firmly in his grasp. His first action as king proved both strategic and deeply symbolic. He captured a small Jebusite fortress positioned on the edge of tribal boundaries, Jerusalem. Belonging neither fully to Judah nor to Israel, it became the neutral heart, uniting a divided people. David established it as his capital city. From that point forward, it would be recognized as the City of David. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there, dancing before it in an undignified display of pure joy. He wore simple linen, not royal robes. His wife Michal, who happened to be Saul's daughter, watched from a window above and felt contempt for him. In that particular moment, David chose authentic worship over maintaining proper royal image. It wouldn't be the final time he sacrificed appearances for something far deeper. David dreamed of constructing a temple, a permanent house for the God who had walked alongside him from pasture to palace. However, the prophet Nathan delivered a different message entirely. David wouldn't build that house. His son would accomplish that task. Yet God established a covenant with David that extended far beyond mere bricks and stone. "Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me." A promise not simply of royal dynasty, but of eternal destiny. Kings, however, are not heavenly angels. Power tests every single soul. David's test arrived not on any battlefield, but rather on a rooftop terrace. It was springtime, the season when kings traditionally go out to war. David remained at home instead. From his elevated roof, he observed her, Bathsheba, bathing in the area below. Desire transformed quickly into a royal summons. She came when called. She conceived a child. Her husband, Uriah the Hittite, was away fighting in battle, serving David's interests faithfully. To conceal the developing scandal, David recalled Uriah from the front, attempting to send him home to his wife. But Uriah refused such comfort, while his fellow soldiers slept exposed in the field. Noble, loyal, deeply inconvenient to David's plans. David sent him back to the battlefield carrying a sealed letter, essentially his own death warrant. Uriah was deliberately placed in the most intense heat of battle, then abandoned by supporting troops. He fell in combat. Bathsheba entered mourning. David married her shortly after. The entire story could have concluded there, neatly concealed beneath royal ceremony and protocol. But Nathan the prophet came to confront him. He presented David with a parable about injustice. A wealthy man stole a poor man's cherished lamb. David, outraged by such wickedness, demanded immediate justice. Nathan turned directly toward him and declared, "You are that man." David completely broke down inside. "I have sinned against the Lord." No excuses offered, no evasion attempted, simply pure confession. The child born from that forbidden union did not survive beyond infancy. But Bathsheba would later bear another son, Solomon. Through him, the royal line would continue forward. David's household, though divinely chosen, was far from immune to internal chaos and turmoil. His children reflected his own passions, his own character flaws. Amnon violated his sister Tamar sexually. David did absolutely nothing in response. Absalom, Tamar's brother, enacted revenge. Then he turned his ambitious eyes toward the throne itself. He gradually won the people's hearts and affections away from David. David found himself fleeing Jerusalem once more. Now, an aging king, barefoot and betrayed by his own flesh and blood. The rebellion was eventually crushed through military force. Absalom became caught by his long hair in an oak tree's branches and was executed there. When David received the news, he wept bitterly. "O Absalom, my son, my son!" A father's anguished cry expressed in a king's voice. David returned to occupy the throne, but the shadows never truly departed. He grew older and more frail. He counted his fighting men, perhaps driven by pride in his accomplishments. A devastating plague followed as consequence. The census represented his final significant misstep. He purchased a threshing floor to construct an altar and halt the plague's spread. That particular site, Mount Moriah, would eventually house Solomon's magnificent temple. Even David's acts of repentance planted seeds of future glory. In his final days approaching, David named Solomon as his chosen heir. He handed his son the detailed plans for the temple, blueprints representing a dream he would never witness fulfilled personally. Then he died, not in battle, not in foreign exile, but peacefully in his own bed. He had ruled for 40 complete years. David's story is decidedly not one of moral perfection. Rather, it's one of intense passion, genuine repentance, and covenant faithfulness. He was simultaneously warrior and poet, sinner and saint, king and humble servant. His legacy wasn't constructed on being faultless, but rather on remaining faithful despite failures. When he stumbled and fell, he got back up. When he committed errors, he wept genuine tears of remorse. And so, for generations, stretching into the future, the people remembered, not Saul, not even Solomon particularly, but David, the man described as being after God's own heart. His name would echo far beyond the written pages of Kings and Chronicles. Prophets would speak of a new David emerging, a branch sprouting from Jesse's root, a shepherd king who would finally bring lasting peace. But that represents a story for another time entirely. David, the beloved monarch, had governed with both courage and genuine faith. Under his leadership, Israel had experienced prosperity and peaceful times. Yet his reign, like all earthly things, was far from free of cost. His heart, described as a heart oriented after God's, proved also capable of profound sin. The most grievous of these transgressions was his adulterous affair with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of his most loyal soldiers serving in his army. When Bathsheba became pregnant, David attempted to cover his wrongdoing by arranging for Uriah to be deliberately positioned at the most dangerous front lines of battle, where he was killed in action. The prophet Nathan confronted David directly, exposing the full depth of his transgression. The resulting consequences would reverberate throughout David's remaining life. Yet even amid his grievous sin, the Lord didn't abandon him completely. David's heart remained tender, genuinely repentant, and he actively sought restoration of relationship. However, the kingdom, once unified under a single king's rule, was beginning to fracture, not only from the lingering effects of sin, but from internal divisions that had started growing beneath the surface. David's household, once characterized by unity and strength, became increasingly a house marked by conflict and division. The very family that had symbolized God's covenant relationship with Israel now stood precariously at the edge of rebellion. David's son Absalom would be the one to ignite this rebellion into flames. Absalom was a striking individual, handsome and charismatic, gifted with a sharp intellect. Yet beneath the polished surface, he harbored deep resentment directed toward his father. His anger had been kindled after his brother Amnon, another of David's sons, sexually assaulted his sister Tamar. The profound injustice of the act was compounded significantly by David's failure to take action, as he didn't pursue justice on Tamar's behalf. Absalom, burning with righteous rage, took matters into his own hands, murdering Amnon to avenge his sister's violation. David's inability to reconcile the fractured family relationships led to a lengthy estrangement between father and son. Years passed slowly, and Absalom, who had been living in exile, eventually returned to Jerusalem. He set about winning the hearts of the people, positioning himself at the city gate and offering judgment to those who approached him. Gradually, systematically, he built support, and before long, he declared himself king, effectively declaring war against his own father. The rebellion unfolded swiftly, and David, once the mighty warrior who feared no enemy, now found himself fleeing Jerusalem, accompanied by his loyal followers. His heart, burdened heavily with the weight of betrayal, was torn between love and duty. David's flight was punctuated by a series of deeply poignant moments, some utterly heartbreaking. As he crossed over the Mount of Olives, a man named Shimei, a member of Saul's extended family, hurled stones at him while cursing him loudly. One of David's men wanted to strike Shimei down immediately, but David, in a remarkable moment of humility, prevented him. "Let him curse," David said with weary resignation. "Perhaps the Lord will observe my misery and compensate me with good in return." Even while experiencing such intense personal pain, David didn't seek vengeance for himself, trusting instead that God would act in his perfect timing. The battle between father and son reached its climax in a confrontation within the forests of Ephraim. Absalom, with his famously long hair caught hopelessly in the branches of a tree, was discovered by David's men hanging there. Joab, David's military commander, faced an agonizing moral dilemma: whether to kill Absalom and permanently end the rebellion, or to demonstrate mercy toward the son of the king. Joab made his decision, and Absalom was killed. The news of Absalom's death absolutely shattered David's heart. He wept uncontrollably, crying out in anguish, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would I had died in your place, O Absalom, my son, my son!" The death of Absalom marked the conclusion of an intensely painful chapter in David's life, but it also represented a significant turning point for the kingdom. The rebellion had ended, yet the fractures running through Israel had only deepened further. David's return to Jerusalem didn't immediately bring peace with it. The kingdom remained divided in both heart and spirit. The people had personally witnessed the devastating consequences of disobedience and sin, and the land itself carried the visible scars of this division. David, now an elderly man, sought earnestly to restore peace throughout the kingdom. He reconciled with those who had rebelled against him, including his loyal general Joab, who had played such a crucial role in defeating Absalom's forces. Yet the wounds from the past remained unhealed, and David's final years were characterized by ongoing internal strife. His son Adonijah, seeking to seize the throne for himself, attempted a coup while David still lived. But David, though old and physically frail, formally declared Solomon, his son by Bathsheba, to be his chosen heir and successor. Solomon, wise far beyond his years, ascended to the throne, marking the beginning of the next significant chapter in Israel's history. David's final days were devoted to preparing Solomon for the immense weight of kingship. He charged Solomon earnestly to walk faithfully in the ways of the Lord, to keep all the commandments, and to construct the temple that David himself had longed to build. With his dying breath, David reminded Solomon of the sacred covenant with God, the promises originally made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the absolute need for the king to remain faithful to God's commands. David's reign, though undeniably marred by personal failings and the rebellion of his own son, was nevertheless one of tremendous significance. His heart devoted to God, his undying love for Israel, and his deep sorrow over the consequences of sin created a legacy that would resonate powerfully for generations yet to come. The kingdom stood divided, yet the hope of eventual restoration remained alive. The story of David's reign reveals clearly the complexity of human nature itself, the ongoing struggle between faithfulness and failure, between strength and vulnerability, between wisdom and foolishness. It serves as a reminder that even the greatest of leaders carry flaws and desperately need redemption. Yet even in the absolute darkest moments of betrayal and division, God's purposes can still be accomplished and fulfilled. As Solomon assumed the throne and the kingdom transitioned into a new era, the lessons learned from David's reign would continue shaping Israel's future. But the question lingered heavily in the air. Would the division plaguing the kingdom ever truly be healed? Could the once united people of Israel be restored to their former glory and strength? Or was the kingdom destined to fracture even further under the crushing weight of sin and ongoing rebellion? Solomon's reign begins with bloodshed. He inherits far more than just a crown. He receives a kingdom weighed down heavily by enemies, rivals, and unhealed wounds remaining from his father David's turbulent reign. Before the son can rule in genuine peace, the ghosts from David's unfinished business must be laid to rest permanently. Solomon accomplishes this with cold, calculated precision. Adonijah, his older half-brother and former rival for the throne, requests Abishag, a young woman who once provided care for David in his final days. The request appears harmless on the surface, but to Solomon it carries the unmistakable scent of sedition. Taking a former king's concubine was, in ancient political dynamics, essentially a quiet coup attempt. Solomon doesn't pause to deliberate. Adonijah is eliminated swiftly. So is Joab, David's once mighty general. So is Shimei, the man who once cursed David and was shown mercy. One by one, loose ends are tied off with complete finality. Only then, when the old order lies buried, does Solomon truly begin his reign. He starts not with warfare, but with wisdom as his foundation. When asked by the divine presence what he desires above all else, Solomon doesn't select riches, extended life, or military conquest. He asks for a discerning heart instead, the ability to judge wisely, to distinguish clearly between good and evil. It's precisely the right answer. In return, Solomon receives everything he didn't even request. Wealth beyond measure, lasting peace, widespread fame, and a reputation so brilliant it reaches the ears of foreign monarchs far away. The stories grow larger with each retelling. Two women appear before him, both claiming to be the mother of a single living infant. Solomon listens carefully. Then he calls for a sword to be brought. "Divide the child in two," he announces. One woman gasps in absolute horror and offers to surrender the child to save its life. The other calmly agrees to the division. Solomon hands the baby to the one who demonstrated compassion. She is clearly the mother. The people stand, stunned. The legend is born in that moment. Wisdom isn't the only thing Solomon builds during his reign. He constructs numerous alliances, dozens of them, through strategic marriages. Pharaoh's daughter becomes one of his many wives. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women all join his rapidly growing household. With them arrive customs, foreign gods, and pagan altars. What begins as diplomatic maneuvering becomes gradual spiritual erosion. Initially, it doesn't seem to matter much. Solomon is too occupied building something far more significant, the temple itself. His father David had dreamed of it for years. A permanent house for the ark, a fixed dwelling place for God's presence. But David was a man defined by war. It would be his son, a man of peace, who would actually raise the walls. The construction requires 7 full years to complete. Tens of thousands of laborers are conscripted for the work. Stones are cut in quarries, located far from the temple site, so the sacred grounds remain silent throughout construction. No iron tool is heard ringing on the mount itself. The temple's interior surfaces are lined with fragrant cedar and gleaming gold. Palm trees, flowers, and cherubim are carefully carved into the walls. The Holy of Holies forms a perfect cube. Inside it, 2 massive cherubim figures stand wing to wing, sheltering the Ark of the Covenant beneath them. When the construction is finally complete, the ark is ceremonially brought inside. As the priests withdraw from the inner chamber, a cloud fills the temple so thick and heavy that no one can remain standing. The glory of the Lord has arrived in physical manifestation, and Solomon speaks aloud. The Lord has declared that he would dwell in thick darkness, a profound paradox uttered amidst gold and smoke. The temple isn't the only structure Solomon builds during his reign. He constructs entire cities, massive storehouses, stables for horses, elaborate palaces, and seaports. He develops a naval fleet. He oversees extensive trade routes that stretch all the way from the Gulf of Aqaba to the gates of Egypt and beyond. Gold pours into the kingdom from Ophir. Spices, exotic woods, and precious stones arrive regularly. His kingdom throbs with commercial activity and trade. Tribute flows inward steadily. Enemy nations remain quiet and subdued. There is absolutely no war during Solomon's 40-year reign. It truly is a golden age, but one purchased with heavy burdens on the people. Forced labor becomes commonplace throughout the kingdom. Taxes prove increasingly heavy. Tribal resentments begin simmering just beneath the surface. 10 of the 12 tribes feel marginalized, overworked, underrepresented politically. Jerusalem shines brilliantly, but the outer regions grow increasingly restless. And then there are the wives. Solomon accumulates 700 wives and 300 concubines eventually. With them come altars and shrines dedicated to foreign deities. Chemosh, Molech, Ashtoreth. The same king who once built the temple now builds high places for idol worship. His heart, the text tells us, turns gradually away. It doesn't happen suddenly. It occurs slowly, gradually. A series of seemingly small concessions, subtle shifts in priority. But, over extended time, the very thing Solomon once prayed for, the ability to discern clearly, begins to fade noticeably. The consequences arrive in whispers initially. God informs Solomon that the kingdom will be torn apart, not during his lifetime, but certainly in his son's. The judgment is delayed out of respect for David's memory, but not avoided entirely, and enemies begin to stir from their slumber. Hadad, an Edomite prince who survived Joab's purge decades earlier, rises up in the south. Rezon, a former servant of Zobah, causes significant trouble in the north. And then there's Jeroboam, a man from Ephraim's tribe, who gains initial favor, then flees into exile after a prophecy reveals he will someday rule 10 tribes. Solomon grows old gradually. The splendor of his royal court remains impressive, but the inner glow has definitely dimmed. His achievements are undeniably remarkable. His failures prove equally catastrophic. He is remembered as the wisest man who ever lived, yet he couldn't rule his own heart effectively. He writes, or rather, writings are later attributed to him. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs. Some practical and instructive, some poetic and beautiful, some deeply existential and questioning. Everything is meaningless, one line declares. A chasing after the wind. A weary voice, emanating from a man who possessed it all and discovered the ultimate limits of having. Solomon dies eventually and is buried in the city of David. He leaves behind a magnificent temple, a full treasury, and a son named Rehoboam. The kingdom appears outwardly stable, but fault lines have already opened beneath the surface. Soon, everything he built so carefully, every gilded wall, every mountain shrine, every diplomatic marriage, will begin to crack and crumble. Solomon's reign represents the absolute peak. It also marks the beginning of inevitable decline. Wisdom made him truly great, but unchecked power made him spiritually blind. His story embodies both triumph and tragedy in equal measure, and the shadow of his choices will stretch far beyond his grave into future generations. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, ascends to the throne following his father's death. His reign begins with promise, but rapidly spirals into devastating division. The people, burdened heavily by Solomon's taxation and forced labor, approach Rehoboam seeking relief. They arrive with a straightforward request: lighten our load, make things easier. The elders who served Solomon wisely advised the new king to listen to the people carefully, to ease their burdens significantly, and thereby secure their loyalty. Yet Rehoboam turns instead to his peers, the young men he grew up alongside, seeking their counsel. They urge him to assert his power forcefully, to make the people bow completely before him, and to actually increase their suffering. With the people's reasonable request denied, Rehoboam responds with a harsh proclamation that seals his fate. "My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." The words function as a signal, an ultimatum. The kingdom trembles instantly. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel reject the house of David outright. They secede, establishing their own kingdom in the north with Jeroboam as their chosen king. The southern kingdom of Judah, bound to Rehoboam, remains intact, but it is significantly diminished. The promise of a united Israel lies shattered completely. The people of the north, once united under David's reign, now stand divided both in territory and spirit. Jeroboam, now king of Israel, faces his own significant challenges. Fearing that his people will return south to Judah to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, he creates 2 golden calves as alternatives, one in Bethel and one in Dan. "Here are your gods, O Israel," he declares boldly. These idols represent a political maneuver designed to prevent the people of Israel from returning to worship Yahweh in Jerusalem. He builds altars, establishes rival festivals, and leads the people directly into idolatry. The northern kingdom begins its descent into moral decay, deliberately forsaking the covenant. Meanwhile, Rehoboam in Judah watches as the kingdom he inherited crumbles before his eyes. His rule becomes increasingly marked by weakness and internal strife. The people of Judah also drift from the path of righteousness. Rehoboam's reign becomes a faint echo of Solomon's former glory, but it completely lacks the wisdom and vision that once guided Israel effectively. He too embraces idolatry openly. High places, sacred groves, and altars to foreign gods appear throughout the land of Judah. Despite this widespread moral decay, the kingdom of Judah continues to possess the temple, the powerful symbol of God's presence dwelling among them. The southern kingdom holds firmly to a semblance of the old ways, the ancient traditions. But even this fragile connection to the divine weakens progressively over time. The division between the north and the south becomes more than merely political. It represents a spiritual rift, a clear sign of the fractured state of Israel as a whole. The years pass slowly, and the 2 kingdoms stagger along, each one grappling with its own distinct problems. In Israel, the kingship shifts rapidly and violently. Jeroboam is followed by a series of rulers who are by and large wicked and rebellious. Omri, who comes to power later, secures the throne through brutal assassination, founding a dynasty that rules for several generations. His son Ahab emerges as one of the most infamous kings in Israel's history, a man whose actions are characterized by idolatry and open rebellion against Yahweh. Ahab's marriage to Jezebel, a Phoenician princess, leads Israel even deeper into the worship of Baal. The prophets of Yahweh are systematically silenced, and the people are drawn further into the worship of foreign gods with increasing intensity. But Yahweh, in his mercy, raises up prophets to speak truth directly to power. Elijah, the great prophet of the northern kingdom, confronts both Ahab and Jezebel with a fierce challenge. A dramatic showdown at Mount Carmel. There, Elijah calls down fire from heaven itself, proving conclusively that the God of Israel is the true God. Yet, even after such a dramatic display of divine power, Ahab and Jezebel persist stubbornly in their rebellion. Meanwhile, in Judah, the line of David continues forward. Rehoboam's son Abijah takes the throne, but his reign is characterized by instability and continued idolatry. Asa, his son, rises to power next, and under his rule, Judah experiences a brief period of reform and renewal. Asa removes idols forcefully, renews the covenant, and brings some measure of stability to the southern kingdom. But even he struggles to maintain the people's loyalty consistently. The idolatry that once seemed distant now takes deep root in the hearts of the people, despite the king's efforts to purge it completely. The division between the northern and southern kingdoms grows ever more pronounced and hostile. Israel, with its series of corrupt kings, plunges deeper into sin with each passing generation, while Judah clings to its covenant, though increasingly faltering. The once unified nation of Israel is now a distant memory, fading into legend. Its people divided both politically and spiritually, possibly beyond repair. The prophets continue to speak boldly, warning both kingdoms of the serious consequences of their sin. Israel, in particular, faces the looming threat of foreign conquest. The Assyrians, a mighty empire located to the northeast, begin to turn their eyes toward the northern kingdom with hostile intent. Their expansion is swift and brutal beyond description. Israel, weakened severely by its idolatry and internal strife, falls prey to Assyria's overwhelming power. In 722 BC, the capital city of Samaria is conquered, and the 10 northern tribes are carried off into permanent exile. The kingdom of Israel ceases to exist entirely. Judah, though, still stands for now. The line of David remains in Jerusalem. The temple, though desecrated and neglected at various times, endures. But even Judah is not immune to the judgment of God. The prophets continue to warn the people of the coming destruction if they do not turn back completely to Yahweh. This chapter in Israel's history is marked by division, widespread idolatry, and the slow unraveling of a once unified kingdom. The rupture between the north and the south is not merely a political split, but a spiritual one, symbolizing the deeper fractures within the hearts of the people themselves. The kingdom of Israel, once the land of David's glorious dynasty, is now divided and fractured beyond recognition. The southern kingdom of Judah remains standing, but the glory of the past is a distant memory, fading further with each passing year. The kingdom was split in two, and the air smelled heavily of smoke. Not the smoke of incense burning in the temple at Jerusalem. No, this was the smoke of burning altars, strange sacrifices, and the beginning of the end. In the north, the kingdom of Israel had broken away completely, defiant and fast-moving. 10 tribes under Jeroboam's leadership, carving their own story separate from Judah. They wanted their own places of worship, their own high places, their own kings. But they inherited something else alongside this, too: instability and chaos. Kingdoms that rise quickly often fall just as fast. And God, as the scriptural text tells it, would not remain silent. So the prophets came, not as priests in ceremonial robes, but as wild-eyed messengers, as voices crying in the wilderness, as thunder before the approaching storm. First came Elijah. His name meant, "My God is Yahweh," and that wasn't simply a name. It was a direct challenge. He lived during the reign of King Ahab, one of the most notorious rulers of Israel's northern kingdom. Ahab had married Jezebel, a Phoenician princess and priestess of Baal. Under her powerful influence, the northern kingdom leaned deep into idolatry, building temples to Baal and Asherah. The people bowed to foreign gods willingly. The covenant faded into distant memory. Elijah arrived without any fanfare. He came from Tishbe, a completely unknown place. He wore camel hair and ate what ravens brought him daily. He didn't ask anyone's permission. He simply walked directly into Ahab's court and declared that no rain would fall until he gave the word. And then he vanished completely. Drought scorched the land mercilessly. Crops failed entirely. Livestock died in the fields. Jezebel raged furiously, and Elijah, hidden by God's protection, lived beside a brook, fed by birds, then later by a starving widow in Zarephath. The miracles began quietly enough. a jar of flour that never emptied, oil that never ran dry. Then a boy died unexpectedly, and Elijah stretched his body over him and breathed life back into his lungs. But his real confrontation would be devastatingly public. 3 years into the drought, Elijah returned to face Ahab. He challenged Ahab's prophets, 450 of Baal and 400 of Asherah, to a contest on Mount Carmel. The rules were simple and straightforward: 2 altars, 2 sacrifices. Whichever god answered with fire was the true God. All day the prophets of Baal danced wildly, screamed desperately, bled themselves. No answer came, no fire appeared. Elijah mocked them with cutting sarcasm. Maybe he's sleeping. Maybe he's relieving himself somewhere. Still nothing at all. Then Elijah rebuilt an old altar dedicated to Yahweh. He poured water on the sacrifice, soaking it thoroughly. He prayed once. Fire fell from heaven. It consumed the stones, the water, the very dust beneath the altar. The people fell on their faces in worship. The Lord, He is God. It was a moment of triumph, a single flash of divine clarity breaking through. But it didn't last long. Jezebel vowed to take his life in revenge. Elijah fled again into the wilderness, then deeper into a cave. There, in complete despair, he waited for God to answer him, not in the violent wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a still small voice, a whisper. This was a turning point. Power and spectacle had failed to convert the hearts of kings. Now the path shifted. Elijah would not see Israel change during his lifetime, but he would anoint a successor to continue the work. Enter Elisha, the farmer with 12 yoke of oxen. He burned his plow as a sign of commitment, kissed his family goodbye, and followed Elijah. His name meant, "My God is salvation." If Elijah was fire and drought, Elisha was healing and provision. He would walk with kings, raise the dead, purify poisoned water, multiply oil for the poor, and even heal Naaman of Syria, a foreign general, from leprosy. When Naaman tried to pay him, Elisha refused firmly. Holiness wasn't for sale. But Elisha's story wasn't just about miraculous signs. It was also about proximity to power. He navigated the corrupt, decaying courts of Israel with great care, often advising kings, sometimes condemning them. He watched as the northern kingdom slid further into idolatry and war, and still the people would not listen. By the time Elisha died, the kingdom was already unraveling. Violence was commonplace. Kings were assassinated in quick succession. The prophetic voice kept speaking through others now, both minor and major prophets, each one carrying the same urgent warning. Return to the covenant, turn from injustice, stop devouring your own people. But the north had fallen too far into itself. The poor were crushed under heavy burdens. The wealthy built ivory houses on the backs of laborers. The courts were corrupt. The religious feasts meant nothing anymore. Ritual without righteousness, empty ceremony. Enter the next wave of prophets. No longer wonder workers performing signs, but poets and prosecutors. Amos came from Judah, a shepherd-turned-prophet who traveled north to deliver a brutal indictment. He had no patience for religious showmanship. His message thundered through the land. I despise your festivals. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. He condemned the elites for selling the poor for silver, for trampling the needy, for silencing the prophets. Then came Hosea with a message not of fire, but of deep heartbreak. God told him to marry a woman who would be unfaithful, a living parable of Israel's betrayal. Hosea's life became the message. His wife, Gomer, left him. He bought her back. He loved her anyway. Through Hosea, God spoke like a spurned lover. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. It was the voice of a God who had every reason to destroy, but chose instead to weep. Still, the end drew near. The Assyrians loomed on the horizon, an empire of iron and fire, known for cruelty and conquest. The prophets saw it coming. They named it plainly. If you will not return, destruction will come from the north. And yet, even in these warnings, the voice of hope persisted. A remnant would survive. The covenant would not die. The line of David would not be extinguished. The land would not forget its promise. But for now, the sky was darkening. The northern kingdom had heard the prophets. It had seen fire fall from heaven. It had tasted divine mercy and miraculous provision. But it had chosen power, wealth, and idols instead. And so the last warnings went out. The prophets were not fortune-tellers. They were truth-tellers. They weren't predicting the future. They were interpreting the present. They weren't saying what might happen. They were saying what must happen if things didn't change. Israel didn't listen. And history was coming with iron chariots and foreign tongues, with exile and erasure, with the silence of abandoned altars. But even in the darkest moments, the prophets had planted something deeper, a memory, a possibility, a still small voice. The Assyrian Empire was ruthless, an unstoppable force of destruction. The northern kingdom of Israel, once a thriving land, now faced its end. The people of Israel had turned from their covenant with God, falling into idolatry, injustice, and rebellion. The prophets issued their warnings, but no one paid attention. The calls to turn back were dismissed. Israel had strayed too far from the path laid out for them, and now the moment of judgment had arrived. In the year 722 BCE, the Assyrians, commanded by King Shalmaneser V, descended from the northern territories. Their forces were enormous, their tactics unrelenting. The northern tribes, fractured and weakened by internal conflict and their abandonment of faith, had virtually no chance of survival. Samaria, Israel's capital city and stronghold, collapsed after enduring a siege that lasted 3 years. The Assyrians captured the city, and along with it, they took the people of Israel. The survivors were forced into exile, dispersed throughout the empire, compelled to live in lands that were not their own. The 10 northern tribes disappeared into the currents of history, destined never to return. This marked the conclusion of the Kingdom of Israel as it had existed. These 10 tribes, collectively remembered as the Lost Tribes, were consumed by the empire's relentless appetite for dominance. The people were absorbed into the Assyrian Empire, their unique identity eroded and lost in the ever-shifting sands of time. The land that had been promised to the descendants of Abraham now stood as a barren testament to the failure of living in alignment with God's commandments. The collapse of Israel was more than a political defeat. It represented a spiritual catastrophe. The kingdom had been established upon a covenant with God, a promise to be his people and to live according to his law. Yet Israel's leaders, beginning with King Jeroboam and continuing through those who came after him, had turned away from that covenant. They erected altars to foreign deities. They permitted injustice to spread unchecked, and they led their people away from truth. For years, the prophets had foretold their downfall. Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea had all issued warnings about the destruction that was coming. They had preached about turning back, but the people refused to listen. Hosea, the final prophet to minister to the northern kingdom, had poured out his heart in anguish, pleading with Israel to return to God. His message carried the weight of painful love and deep sorrow. He compared Israel's worship of idols to a wife's unfaithfulness, a betrayal too serious to ignore. But the people of Israel remained deaf to the call for repentance. Their hearts had grown hard, and their wrongdoing had become too overwhelming to reverse. Hosea's warnings landed on deaf ears, and the destruction of Israel became unavoidable. Assyria's conquest of Israel represented more than just the end of a kingdom. It served as a warning to the people of Judah in the southern territory. Israel's fall should have awakened Judah to reality. It stood as a harsh reminder of what occurs when God's people turn their backs on him. However, Judah was also living on borrowed time. Though they experienced moments of faithfulness, they were not exempt from the consequences of disobedience. The prophets of Judah, including Isaiah and Jeremiah, would soon issue their own calls to repentance, warning their people that the same fate that had overtaken Israel could easily become their own. The Assyrian Empire, despite its vastness, was not invincible. In the grand sweep of history, its reign would prove short-lived, but for the people of Israel, their fall was final. Their land no longer belonged to them. The once powerful kingdom of Israel had been scattered, becoming a memory of what had been and a lesson for generations yet to come. The fall of Israel also marked a turning point in the story of God's people. It represented the moment when the nation's identity began to fracture. While the people of Judah would continue to inhabit their land for a time, the kingdom of Israel was lost to the pages of history. The pressing question now became, what would happen to God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Had the covenant been shattered? Had Israel's rejection of God's ways caused the promises to crumble? Yet even in the darkest hour of Israel's collapse, a glimmer of hope persisted. The promises made to the patriarchs were not invalidated by Israel's failure. The God who had called Abraham from Ur and promised him a land and descendants would not abandon his word. Though Israel had failed, God's plan would not be derailed. The light of his covenant would continue to shine through in unexpected ways. The fall of Israel was a moment of profound loss, but it was simultaneously a moment of divine preparation. For although the northern kingdom would never be restored in the same manner, the southern kingdom of Judah would carry forward the legacy. And from Judah, through a line of kings that would eventually lead to David's greater descendant, the Messiah would emerge. The fall of Israel would give way to a deeper understanding of God's love and mercy, his capacity to bring about redemption from the most unlikely of circumstances. The people who had been lost would one day be found. For now, however, the people of Israel were scattered. Their land was occupied by the Assyrians. Their cities lay in ruins. Yet, even in exile, God was not finished with them. Their story would continue in ways they could not yet perceive. Though they were lost, they were not forgotten. The northern kingdom was gone, swallowed entirely by the Assyrian Empire. Its cities shattered, its people scattered to the four winds. 10 tribes vanished into history. But in the south, Judah still stood, smaller, poorer, but still breathing. The temple still rose above Jerusalem's hills, a flickering flame in the darkness. And into this uneasy, calm walked voices like thunder, cloaked in rags, eyes blazing with the weight of divine speech. They were called prophets, not fortune-tellers, not magicians, but messengers, intercessors, mouthpieces of a restless, wounded God. They weren't liked, they weren't trusted. Most of the time, they weren't even believed. But they spoke anyway, because silence was never an option. They came to the kings, to the priests, to the people in the streets, and shouted what no one wanted to hear. This covenant you cling to has terms. You broke them. There is a price. And yet, even in the ash and thunder of judgment, they always left room for a whisper of hope. In the 8th century BCE, during the final days of the Northern Kingdom and the anxious years that followed, Judah witnessed the rise of its greatest prophetic voices. Among them, one name towers over the rest, Isaiah, son of Amos. He spoke in poetry, in visions, in riddles. A man of the royal court, a prophet who walked with kings and stood in the holy sanctuary. He began his ministry during the reign of King Uzziah and continued through the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. It was a turbulent time of political intrigue, foreign threats, and internal decay. Isaiah's first words were not gentle. "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken." The land was drenched in ritual, but dry of justice. Offerings were made, but widows starved. Incense filled the temple, but the streets ran red. And Isaiah called it out with brutal clarity. God was not pleased by burnt sacrifices. God was looking for broken pride, for hearts that turned, for hands that helped. Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. To Isaiah, righteousness was not private. It was public, social. It had to be lived on the ground, not chanted in a temple. He saw injustice not just as a sin against humanity, but as treason against the covenant. But Isaiah was not just a critic. He was a visionary. In one moment, he would announce that judgment was coming, swift and unavoidable. In the next, he would cast his eyes beyond the smoke to see something beautiful, a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a future king, a servant who would suffer, a peace so deep that lions would lie with lambs and children would play where snakes once hid. He saw what was and what could be, and in that tension, he spoke. Isaiah's voice echoes through time, not just in Judah, but through centuries of literature, politics, and theology. His words became the backbone of later hopes. His image of the suffering servant would haunt the future. His dreams of peace would become liturgy. And he was not alone. In the generation after Isaiah came Micah, a rural prophet, a man from the countryside near Moresheth. Where Isaiah thundered in royal halls, Micah spoke in the voice of the poor. He too warned of judgment. He too saw injustice choking the land. But his language cut closer to the bone. He called out the corruption of the cities, the bribes in the courts, the oppression of the farmer by the landowner. They covet fields and seize them. Micah saw what power did in the shadows, and he dragged it into the light. But Micah also gave voice to something soft, a distilled cry of what God truly desired. What does the Lord require of you? To do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. One line, 1,000 years of law and sacrifice distilled into a single whisper. Not that ritual didn't matter, but ritual without humility was hollow. Justice without love was tyranny. Micah, like Isaiah, wasn't tearing down the faith. He was calling it back to its spine. Meanwhile, across the decades, as kings came and went, as Assyria loomed and waned, another voice began to rise. One shaped not by privilege or prophecy, but by pain. His name was Jeremiah. He was young when he was called. Too young, he thought. He tried to refuse, but the voice came anyway. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. He was born in Anathoth, a town of priests. But Jeremiah would become a prophet of lament, a weeping prophet, a man whose very life became a symbol of what was to come. He spoke in metaphors, broken cisterns, shattered jars, diseased figs. His prophecies weren't just sermons, they were performance art, warnings wrapped in riddles. Jeremiah watched Judah slide toward ruin, not in one fall, but in a long, slow spiral. False peace, foreign alliances, a denial of consequences. The people thought the temple would protect them, that the presence of God made the city untouchable. Jeremiah said otherwise. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, "This is the temple of the Lord." The temple had become an idol, the presence had become an excuse, and the Babylonians were coming. Jeremiah saw what no one wanted to see, that judgment was not only inevitable, it was deserved. But even here, in his bitterest hour, Jeremiah never stopped hoping. "The days are coming," he said, "when I will make a new covenant. Not like the old one, etched in stone and broken time and time again, but a covenant written on hearts, a relationship not guarded by priests or kings, but carried in the soul of every person." Jeremiah would live to see the worst. He would witness Jerusalem burn. He would be dragged to Egypt against his will. He would die in exile, uncelebrated in his own time. But his words survived. His tears, inked on scrolls, became part of the soul of Scripture. By the end of the 7th century BCE, Judah had been warned again and again. From the heights of Jerusalem to the fields of Moresheth, the prophets had shouted, whispered, wept. They had pleaded for change. They had offered a way back. But the hearts of kings were hard. The trust in politics was deep, and Babylon was moving closer. The south had prophets, but would it listen? That is the question that echoes as we move into the storm. Nebuchadnezzar's armies marched across the land, their steps heavy with destiny. Each one brought them closer to the city that held the last remnants of Israel's glory. Jerusalem, once a symbol of divine favor, now stood vulnerable. Its walls weakened by internal strife, its people clinging to a promise that seemed increasingly distant. The siege began with relentless force, as Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, tightened its grip around the city. The people inside, desperate and starving, could only watch as the enemy drew nearer. For years, they had been warned, first by the prophet Isaiah and later by Jeremiah, that this moment would come if they did not turn from their ways, if they did not heed the voice of God. Yet they had remained obstinate, hoping that divine protection would somehow intervene. Now the prophecy was unfolding in the bitterest of realities. The city fell in 586. B.C.E. The walls of Jerusalem were breached, and the temple that Solomon had built, the very heart of Israel's faith, was reduced to ruins. The golden altar, the Ark of the Covenant, and the sacred vessels that had once held the offerings of the people, all of it was destroyed. The very center of their worship was desecrated. It was a profound moment of grief, a moment where time itself seemed to bend, and every promise of the past turned to dust. The people were carried away, not with honor, but in chains. The strong, the young, the wise, all marched from the city to the distant lands of Babylon. Among them were the artisans, the leaders, the priests, the elders, the lifeblood of Jerusalem. The rest of the people were left to tend the land, to struggle without the temple, without a king, without a vision of what they had once been. The exile had begun. The fall of Judah, like the fall of Israel before it, was not a simple defeat. It was the culmination of years of disobedience, a consequence of choosing the fleeting power of idolatry over the eternal promise of God. But the exile itself, the journey from the familiar into the unknown, would not be without its own form of transformation. The people who had once been free were now bound, and yet in their bondage, something new would emerge. A people who had relied on a place would come to understand that God's presence was not confined to one location. They would learn that even in exile, God was still with them. The exile was not merely a punishment, it was a crucible for renewal. In Babylon, the people faced an uncertain future. They were far from home, away from their beloved land, their temple, and their customs. They lived among strangers, their captors, in a land that was both foreign and harsh. And yet, in that foreignness, they began to find new ways to preserve their identity. The synagogues began to emerge, places where the people gathered to read the scriptures, to study, to pray. No longer could they rely on the rituals of the temple. Instead, they learned to rely on the word itself, on the sharing of stories and prayers. The exile became, in some ways, a reawakening. The people of Judah learned the value of community, of sharing their faith with one another, even in the absence of a king or a temple. The prophets, too, continued to speak in exile. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, remained in Jerusalem during the destruction, but he had long since prophesied the coming fall. In Babylon, the prophet Ezekiel began to speak, offering a vision of hope amidst the devastation. Ezekiel saw the valley of dry bones, a vision that spoke of the restoration of the people. Though the body of Israel lay scattered and broken, God would breathe life back into them. This was a vision not just of physical restoration, but of spiritual rebirth. The people would return, yes, but not in the same way. Their understanding of God, of themselves, would be different. The exile would forge them into a new people, a people who would no longer rely on the temple or the land alone, but on the living God, who could be with them anywhere. As the years passed, the weight of the exile remained heavy. But even in their sorrow, the people began to recognize the faintest glimmer of hope. The Persian Empire, which had risen to power, would change the course of their destiny. King Cyrus, the ruler of Persia, issued a decree that would alter the course of history. He declared that the exiled Jews could return to their land and rebuild the temple. The people of Judah, once scattered and broken, began to find their way back. The journey from Babylon to Jerusalem was long and arduous, but it was filled with purpose. They returned not just to a land, but to a calling, to rebuild what had been broken, to restore what had been lost. But as they began the arduous work of rebuilding the temple, they faced opposition. The surrounding peoples, who feared the resurgence of Judah, sought to stop the reconstruction. Despite the challenges, the exiles remained steadfast, driven by a vision of a restored people and a renewed covenant with God. The story of the exile, of the fall of Judah, and the promise of return is one of both devastation and hope. It is the story of a people who were broken, scattered, and lost, but who, through the grace of God, would find restoration. The exile did not destroy the faith of the people. Rather, it refined it. It forced them to confront their past failures, to acknowledge their need for God, and to embrace the reality that God's presence is not bound by place or temple, but is with them wherever they go. The fall of Judah was not the end of the story, but a chapter in a much larger narrative. It was a moment of judgment, but it was also a moment of grace. And as the people returned from exile, they began to understand that the story of their faith was not defined by their failures, but by God's faithfulness. Their history, once marred by disobedience and loss, would now become the foundation for a new beginning. The restoration of Judah, the rebuilding of the temple, and the return of the exiles marked a new chapter in the story of Israel. But even in the midst of their return, the shadows of their past mistakes lingered. The people had been warned, the prophets had spoken, but the exile had taught them something deeper, that no matter how far they wandered, no matter how broken they became, God would always offer a way back. And in this hope, the story of the Old Testament moves forward toward a future where the people, renewed and restored, would once again stand in the presence of their God. By the rivers of Babylon, they sat down and wept. Not in metaphor, not in parable, but in grief so thick it carved lines into the bones of a people. Jerusalem had fallen. Not just the city, but the idea. The temple, once gleaming with Solomon's gold, lay smoldering in ruins. The Ark of the Covenant, centerpiece of divine presence, was gone, lost to flames or hidden in fear. The Davidic line, thought eternal, was shattered. The covenant appeared broken. What came next was exile, not just of body, but of soul. The Babylonians didn't simply conquer, they dismantled, they unstitched culture. Deportation wasn't just punishment, it was strategy. Remove the elite, the priests, the scribes, the artisans. Leave the farmers. Bleed a people of its memory. Assimilate what's left. It was empire by eraser. And yet this moment, this absolute devastation, became the crucible of survival. The exile forged Judaism from the remnants of Israel. The Book of Lamentations is the rawest account we have. 5 poetic dirges, likely penned by someone who witnessed the fall firsthand. Its voice is female, maternal, as Jerusalem is personified as daughter Zion. Once radiant, now humiliated, staggering through the ruins. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. It begins with disbelief, then spirals through mourning, shame, accusation, and aching hope. Each poem in Lamentations is an acrostic in Hebrew, alphabetical cries of order in the midst of chaos. Even pain, it seems, demanded structure. In the exile, psalms became lifelines, not just songs of praise, but of protest, of accusation. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? One psalmist asks. The tone is not submissive, it's defiant. A people stripped of their temple, language, land and monarchy, but not their voice. The Psalms from exile are among the darkest in the collection. They don't hide their rage. They remember Zion, not with serenity but with fire in the throat. And through it all, the prophets did not go silent. Jeremiah, taken against his will to Egypt, continued to speak. Ezekiel, now among the exiles, began his strange visions. Wheels within wheels, bones coming to life, a temple not yet built. Isaiah, or rather the later voice behind his name, cried out a new theme. "Comfort, comfort my people," he said. "Speak tenderly to Jerusalem." This shift marked the beginning of a theological revolution. The exile posed a question so big it threatened to undo everything. If Yahweh was the God of Israel, how could Babylon win? How could the temple be destroyed, the land lost, the people scattered, and yet this God still be sovereign? The answer was as radical as it was redemptive. Yahweh, they came to believe, was not merely the God of Israel. He was the God over all history. Babylon was not stronger. Babylon was a tool, an instrument of divine justice. Israel's sin, its idolatry, its injustice, its arrogance had brought this upon them. But punishment did not mean abandonment. This theological pivot allowed survival. The exile became not the end of the story, but the middle. A dark middle, but one laced with purpose. And it reshaped everything. Without the temple, worship shifted inward into text, into community, into memory. The synagogue rose in place of the sanctuary. Prayer replaced sacrifice. Torah became the center. Scribes, once auxiliary, became sacred. And new literature began to appear. The priestly authors who had fled began writing or compiling the stories that would form the backbone of the Hebrew Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, texts we now know as the Torah, were shaped and ordered during or shortly after the exile. The stories of Abraham, Moses, and David were no longer just heritage. They were hope, a claim to identity in a world bent on stealing it. The exile also birthed apocalyptic imagination. In the absence of political restoration, dreams of divine intervention began to flourish. God would act not through kings or armies, but through cosmic upheaval. The foundations of books like Daniel were laid here, even if they wouldn't fully emerge until centuries later. In Babylon, identity became resistance. Dietary laws, circumcision, Sabbath observance. These weren't just rituals, they were rebellion. Every act of fidelity was a refusal to vanish. And so, paradoxically, exile preserved what sovereignty had failed to protect. The memory of Zion grew sharper in absence, the promise more precious for being postponed. But exile didn't erase trauma. It etched it into prayers, poems, genealogies, even into architecture. When the Second Temple would eventually rise in Jerusalem, it would carry none of Solomon's grandeur, but it would carry memory. Every stone a testimony to survival. Back in Babylon, the people began to settle, not in spirit, but in form. They built houses, started businesses, married, had children. They spoke Aramaic. Some rose to prominence in the empire. Others grew bitter. Not all wanted to return. When the day came, exile became a homeland of its own for some. And yet, the longing for Jerusalem never dimmed. Even among those who stayed behind, Zion was the dream. The word itself carried weight. It meant more than a place. It meant restoration, dignity, belonging. Psalm 137 captures that haunting beauty and rage. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. This moment, this grief-soaked, exile-laced, temple-less chapter is one of the most pivotal in all of biblical history. Because it was here, in Babylonian captivity, that Judaism, as we know it, was born. Not as a temple cult, not as a national kingdom, but as a people of the book, a people of memory, a people who could survive diaspora. Exile didn't end the story. It preserved it. Through lament, they remembered. Through silence, they listened. And in Babylon, they wrote the words that would outlast empires. The years of exile, the despair that had settled like a shadow over the people of Judah, were coming to an end. The distant empire of Persia now held dominion over Babylon, and under the reign of Cyrus the Great, the Persian kingdom was different. It was a kingdom of tolerance, a kingdom of fulfilled prophecies. The Israelites, scattered across foreign lands, heard the call to return. The city of Jerusalem, once glorious, lay in ruins. The walls that had protected the city were broken, the temple desecrated, and the land itself was a desolate wasteland. Yet in the heart of this destruction, a seed of hope had begun to sprout. The promises of old were still alive, and with them, the courage to rebuild. Cyrus, following his own vision and the prophecy given to him, declared that the Israelites were free to return to their land. He even offered to fund the rebuilding of their temple. It was a monumental moment in history. The Jewish people were no longer exiles, no longer wandering without a home. Their journey back to the Promised Land began under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, who was tasked with the responsibility of leading this new exodus. The people returned in waves. The journey was arduous, the hardships many. The land had been despoiled, the fields overgrown with weeds, the cities abandoned and decayed. But as they came together, the Israelites did what they had always done. They built. The first priority was the temple. It had been nearly 70 years since it had stood in its full glory. And now, under the supervision of Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the high priest, the foundations were laid. The temple was not only a physical structure, it was a symbol. It was a symbol of God's presence among his people, a reminder of the covenant and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The process of rebuilding was slow, fraught with opposition and struggles. Foreign nations surrounding Jerusalem sought to halt the efforts of the returning exiles. They feared the rise of a strong Israelite kingdom. There were letters sent to the Persian king, accusations made, and attempts to intimidate the workers. Yet the Israelites, driven by a sense of divine purpose, pressed forward. Prophets arose to inspire and encourage the people. Haggai and Zechariah, two prophets of this new era, stirred the hearts of the people. Haggai spoke directly to the workers, urging them not to be discouraged by the small beginnings of the project. He reminded them of the greater glory that was to come, even if they could not yet see it. Zechariah, too, brought messages of hope, of a future where God's kingdom would triumph and the land would be restored in its fullness. Despite these prophetic voices, the rebuilding was still a difficult and slow process. The people grew weary. They faced harsh realities in their efforts. Yet they also began to experience the blessings of returning to their homeland. As the foundations of the temple were laid, they celebrated with great joy. The sound of praise filled the air, and the people wept, for they could hardly believe that their dream had come true. They were home. However, the rebuilding of the temple was only the beginning. The work of restoration was far from over. The land still needed healing. The people still needed guidance. They had returned, but they were not yet fully restored. Ezra, a priest and scribe, was called upon to lead the next phase of this restoration. Ezra was a man of great learning, a scholar of the law who sought to bring the people back to the ways of the Torah. He was a man deeply committed to the religious and spiritual health of the Israelites. With Ezra came a second wave of exiles, and together they worked not only to restore the physical temple, but also to restore the spiritual integrity of the people. Ezra's mission was clear: to teach the people the laws of God, to remind them of their covenant, and to lead them in a renewal of their faith. The people had lived in foreign lands for generations. They had seen the practices and beliefs of other nations, and some had forgotten their own heritage. Ezra sought to bring them back to their roots, to teach them the importance of obedience to God, and to restore the purity of the worship that had once defined Israel. With Ezra's leadership, the people began to come together as a community once more. They gathered to hear the reading of the law, Nehemiah, a fellow leader and servant of the Persian king, was instrumental in the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. Nehemiah's passion for the city and its people was evident in his efforts. He rallied the people to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in record time, ensuring that the city was protected from external threats. Under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, the people began to experience revival. The once broken nation of Israel was now coming back to life. Yet, this was not just a physical rebuilding, it was a spiritual renewal. The people returned to the covenant, to the promises that had once been made to their forefathers. They were reminded of the laws that governed their lives, and they were encouraged to live in accordance with those laws. The new temple, though not as grand as the one built by Solomon, was a beacon of hope. It was a reminder that God had not abandoned his people, that his presence was still with them. The people celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles, and for the first time in years, they rejoiced as a community in the presence of the Lord. But even as the people celebrated, they knew that they were not yet complete. The work of rebuilding the nation would take time. The walls of the city had been restored, but the hearts of the people still needed healing. The people had returned to their land, but their faith, like the land itself, needed to be cultivated. It was a long process, one that would continue for generations to come. Yet there was a renewed sense of hope in the land. God had not abandoned his people. He had made a way for them to return, to rebuild, and to restore what had been lost. And in that restoration, the promise of a future of peace, of prosperity, of justice, began to take shape. The restoration of Jerusalem was not just the rebuilding of walls and temples, it was the rekindling of a nation's soul. It was the renewal of a covenant that would echo through the centuries, calling to all those who would listen, to those who would seek to live in accordance with God's will. In this moment, the people knew that they were more than just survivors of exile. They were the heirs of a promise that had been made long ago. And with each stone they laid, with each prayer they offered, they were shaping a future for their children, for generations yet to come. And as the walls of Jerusalem stood once more, the people looked to the future with hope. The journey of exile was over, but the journey of restoration had just begun. And in this, there was a quiet peace, a peace that only those who had endured the silence of exile could truly understand. In the quiet pages near the end of the Old Testament, a different kind of voice emerges. The tempests of conquest have passed. The fury of prophets has quieted. The temple has been rebuilt, Jerusalem re-inhabited. But now, Israel begins to speak inwardly, not as a nation shouting to the skies, but as individuals sitting beneath olive trees, pondering the pain and purpose of their lives. This is the voice of the wisdom books, the poetic writings, the sacred literature that doesn't command, conquer, or condemn, but instead reflects. There are no mighty kings in these pages, no burning bushes, no thunder on mountaintops. There is only the unyielding riddle of existence and the attempt to face it with open eyes. These are the questions whispered in the corners of the world, in private prayers, in grief-stricken homes, in philosophical reverie under a starlit sky. First among them, Proverbs, a manual for life that speaks like a mentor who has seen enough of the world to know better. It offers short, sharpened sayings, slices of distilled insight. Pride goes before destruction. A soft answer turns away wrath. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom here is not a mystery. It is observable, testable, reliable. Cause and effect are clear. Work diligently, reap success. Walk uprightly, avoid calamity. Be humble, avoid disgrace. But life isn't always so neat. And so, Job. A long sigh of defiance against the simple arithmetic of Proverbs. Job is the righteous man who does everything right and still loses everything. His wealth, his health, his family, his status, his world collapses without warning, and no proverb can explain it. His friends arrive to comfort him, but they don't. Instead, they recite familiar formulas. You must have sinned. God must be just. Therefore, this must be your fault. But Job knows better. He has lived better. What follows is a poetic courtroom. Job versus God. He demands a hearing, a reckoning, an answer. The question, why do the righteous suffer? Why do the wicked prosper? For 37 chapters, the dialogue spirals. Tension mounts. Job oscillates between accusation, despair, and near blasphemous honesty. Then God speaks, but not with a direct answer. Out of a whirlwind, the voice of the Creator thunders. Not justification, but awe. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? It is not explanation, but revelation. God is beyond Job's categories. The world is vast, mysterious, intertwined with chaos and beauty alike. In the end, Job is restored, but not in the same way. He is transformed not by justice, but by encounter. Then there is Ecclesiastes, the strangest wisdom of all. If Proverbs is the optimist and Job the protester, Ecclesiastes is the skeptic, a voice that echoes like wind through empty halls. Vanity of vanities, it begins. All is vanity. The Hebrew word is hevel, mist, vapor, breath. Life is fleeting. The sun rises and sets. Generations come and go. Empires fall. Wealth corrodes. Nothing lasts. The preacher, or Qoheleth, surveys life's pleasures, achievements, philosophies, and finds them all hollow. He's not without hope, but his hope is modest. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Not because it guarantees reward, but because it is right, even if all else is elusive. Ecclesiastes invites readers not to despair, but to see clearly. Life is short, uncertain, and sacred in its fragility. Then comes Psalms, the heart of the Old Testament. A book of poetry, yes, but also of lament, praise, anguish, and wonder. Written over centuries, from palace courtyards to caves of hiding, these are the prayers of Israel's soul. Some psalms shout joyfully, "The heavens declare the glory of God," others weep, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some call for justice with fiery intensity, others ask only for mercy. There are songs of ascent, chanted as pilgrims climb toward Jerusalem, songs of remembrance, tracing the deeds of God through history. Psalms of confession, psalms of celebration, psalms that make room for the full spectrum of human feeling, not sanitized but sanctified through honest expression. The Psalms do not speak to God so much as they speak with him. They turn prayer into poetry and poetry into survival. For a scattered people, the Psalms offered a portable temple, a way to stay connected when the walls of the real one were distant or destroyed. There is one more voice, rarely discussed, rarely preached, but never forgotten. The Song of Songs, a love poem, allegory to some, sensual poetry to others. It celebrates passion, not restrained, but exalted. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. It stands as a defiant inclusion in a holy book, as if to say that human love, physical desire, the longing of bodies and souls, is not excluded from sacred literature. Some interpret it as symbolic, a metaphor for God's love for his people. Others take it at face value and find in its verses the beauty of affection, the joy of intimacy, the holiness of connection. Together, these books form the soul of the Old Testament. They are not stories of nations, but songs of individuals. They do not seek to dominate the world, but to understand it. And in doing so, they speak across millennia, because every person eventually encounters what these books describe: loss, longing, joy, injustice, fleeting time, aching hope. These books do not promise control, they offer perspective. They are the final breath of the Old Testament before history resumes its charge. Before empires rise again, before Rome enters the scene, before New Testaments are written. But here, for just a moment, the story slows, the camera lingers, the dust settles, and the questions remain, not answered, but dignified by being asked. In these writings, we are not told what to think. We are invited to think deeply, to live attentively, to feel honestly, to pray, even if only in whispers, to wrestle with the night until the morning comes. The curtain closes on the Old Testament. The pages of ancient history turn. The echoes of prophecies fade into the past. And the world stands at the precipice of change. The narrative has followed a people from creation to exile, from glory to ruin. But as this chapter closes, the story is not finished. It is only waiting. There is a silence, a profound stillness, pregnant with the tension of what is to come. For though the Israelites have returned to their land, the years between the close of the Old Testament and the rise of the New Testament are filled with anticipation. The world has changed. The might of Babylon has fallen, replaced by Persia. The Persian Empire, under King Cyrus, allowed the Israelites to return and rebuild their temple, their city, and their identity. Yet, the return is not a return to the fullness of glory. The temple is rebuilt, but it lacks the grandeur of Solomon's temple. The walls of Jerusalem are restored, but they do not yet reflect the city's former strength. The people, scattered and weary, seek renewal, but there is a lingering sense of incompleteness. As they rebuild, the memory of the past weighs heavily upon them. The grandeur of Solomon's reign, the kingdom that once united the tribes of Israel, now feels like a distant dream. The people are back in their land, but they are no longer a unified nation. The division between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah still echoes in their culture. The tensions between their past and present continue to shape their identity. But amidst this rebuilding, there is a deep yearning. The prophets have long since faded from the scene, their voices now mere whispers, yet their words remain etched in the hearts of the people. The promises of a Messiah, of a Redeemer who will restore the kingdom, still stir the souls of those who remember. The silence is not one of resignation, but one of expectancy. The people wait for the fulfillment of the prophecies, for the coming of the one who will bring peace, justice, and salvation. During these years of silence, the Israelites live under foreign rule. First the Persians, then the Greeks, and eventually the Romans. The old ways are no longer as they once were. The land is ruled by others, but the longing for self-rule, for freedom, for the reign of the true king, burns ever brighter. The words of the prophets still linger in the air, like a song half forgotten, waiting for someone to sing it again. The silence before the storm is also a time of profound internal struggle. It is a time when the people of Israel wrestle with their identity. Who are they in this new world? Are they a kingdom, a nation, or something else? They no longer have a king from the line of David, and yet the promise of David's throne remains. They no longer have a temple that reflects the glory of God's presence, and yet the covenant with God still stands. The silence is not just the absence of prophecy, but the deep, aching question of what comes next. The people turn to their sacred writings, to the Psalms, the Proverbs, and the wisdom literature of their ancestors. They find solace in the words of the past, but they also find themselves asking new questions. What does it mean to be faithful in a world that has changed so much? What does it mean to wait for the Messiah when centuries have passed and hope has often seemed like a distant dream? In the midst of this waiting, there is also a search for meaning. The books of Ecclesiastes and Job offer profound reflections on the nature of life, suffering, and the search for wisdom. They ask questions that have echoed through the centuries. Why do the righteous suffer? What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of our toil? These questions are not answered easily, but they reflect the deepening complexity of the faith of Israel. This is a faith that no longer simply celebrates the triumphs of a nation, but wrestles with the harsh realities of life. It is a faith that yearns for something more, something beyond what can be seen and touched. The silence also marks a shift in how the people of Israel interact with their world. Once they were a nation with a land, a king, and a temple. But now they are scattered, subject to foreign rule, and their temple is only a shadow of its former self. And yet their sense of identity remains. They are the people of the covenant, the chosen people. And their faith is not dependent on a king or a temple, but on something deeper, something that transcends time and place. It is this faith, this enduring belief in the promises of God, that sustains them through the centuries of silence. The stories of their ancestors, the law of Moses, the wisdom of the Psalms, and the teachings of the prophets all remain alive in the hearts of the faithful. And it is this faith that will carry them through the coming storm. The storm, when it comes, will not be one of military conquest or political upheaval. It will not be the rise of a new empire or the fall of another. The storm that is coming will be a quiet, world-changing event. It will begin not with a thunderous roar, but with the cry of a child in a humble manger. It will be the fulfillment of the promises, the arrival of the Messiah, the one who will restore the kingdom, not with an army, but with a message of peace and salvation. The storm will not be one of war, but of transformation. The Old Testament ends in silence, but it is a silence filled with anticipation. The pages of history are turning, and the people of Israel wait for the fulfillment of the promises. The echoes of the prophets can still be heard, faint but persistent. And as the curtain falls on the story of Israel, the world holds its breath, waiting for the next chapter to begin. The silence before the storm is not the end, but the pause before the beginning of something new. The people of Israel have lived through wars, exiles, and the loss of their land. But they are still here, still waiting. The story of the Old Testament has shaped them, but it has not finished with them. They are waiting for something greater, something more profound, something that will change the world. The Old Testament, with all its stories of creation, fall, exile, and return, has laid the foundation for what is to come. But the world is not yet ready. There is a final chapter waiting to be written, one that will tie together the threads of prophecy, law, wisdom, and history. And in this silence, in this moment of waiting, the Old Testament prepares the stage for the coming of a new story. The world is about to change forever.